Orders of the day.
Government orders. Government bills. Commons. Resuming debate at second reading of Bill C-35. An act to amend the Criminal Code, Law Enforcement Animals, Quanto's Law.
Je crois que ça...
I believe that there are 3 minutes. No, excuse me. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Margaret Fortin. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. C-35 is a bill that is based on a good idea, the idea of protecting service animals, as well as animals who help the police. The NDP is in favor of this bill being studied, because if there's one thing we have to understand, it's that police animals are often wounded by criminals who could have also wounded the police officer. Often, a police dog will take a knife or a bullet in the place of the police officer. So, if it had been the police officer who had been affected, the person who had committed the act would be accused of attempted murder. And we have to ensure that there is specific protection for animals in those circumstances. We have also seen in our society accompaniment service animals and therapy animals who help people, those who there are therapy animals, for example, who help children with autism, among others. And these animals can be, for example, the eyes of somebody who cannot see. They make it possible for an autistic child to communicate, to participate in society. And so we need to offer specific protection to these animals. Voluntarily or injuring an animal for pleasure, any animal, is a bad thing. It's a cruel thing. It's a mean thing. And it's the sort of behavior that we as a society cannot accept. However, we must recognize that the damage caused to society when we injure a service animal is a major crime. And personally, I can tell you that I really like dogs. Every time I see a dog who is helping someone who is blind, I always want to go and pet that animal, and that's something you should never do. I know that. I usually have chocolate in my pockets, and unfortunately the member for Blainville-Terrebonne often takes them from me, which I guess is good for me and for her, but I wouldn't have a hard time imagining the idea of giving chocolate to a dog or to a horse, a police horse, for example. But you shouldn't do that. Now, I love animals, and I would never want to hurt them. But here, it's important that we discuss this bill in committee, that we hear from experts, that we hear from people on the ground who can tell us about situations where it is important to give special protection in the criminal code to these animals. This is a discussion that we have to have, and it's particularly important given that these animals are more and more frequently being used. Often in terrorist attacks with explosives, well, one way to protect against those is with sniffer dogs. Mr. Speaker, there are social phenomena that we are trying to change. Autistic children, for example, we're trying to integrate them more and more into society. And so service animals are used more and more often there. Also, service animals are used to help seniors. there are more and more service animals, and they're becoming more and more useful. And to injure any of these animals is a very severe crime. An attack on an animal is an attack on a person's senses, a person's mobility. So they must be protected. But where the NDP has some problems, and which we'd like to discuss in committee, is the mandatory minimum sentences. And once again, always mandatory minimum sentences. I get the unfortunately, it seems that when the Supreme Court makes a decision, the government doesn't listen to them. It's important that we let judges do their job. We can't take away their latitude and put them in situations where they will feel uncomfortable. And if we look, for example, at the mandatory minimum sentence for possessing a prohibited weapon, there have been cases where decisions have been rendered, where you have an individual who's maybe had a few too many to drink, who goes to see some friends, and one of them has an illegal revolver. He takes it out, he plays with it. That's a criminal offense, and he's filmed. One of his friends takes out his phone and films it. He's charged. He risks spending 5 years in prison. That's the minimum sentence. 5 years. The judge says, well, it's obvious that this person was not particularly brilliant. I think we can all agree on that. It's kind of stupid what he did. But 5 years in prison for somebody who was just, playing with an illegal revolver, that makes no sense. The judge, in this case, said, I'm not going to consider the law here because it doesn't make sense. And he's right. If you can imagine putting someone in prison for 5 years for 15 seconds of utter stupidity. Nobody was ever threatened. Nobody was hurt. He just had been filmed at a party after a few drinks. And I listened to one of my colleagues from British Columbia who was saying that if you kidnap a person who's not an adult, you will get a minimum sentence. And certainly protecting children is good to say, yes, but it calls for a severe prison sentence. The problem is that imagine a young man of 18 years old who's an adult and who has a girlfriend who's 16 years old. They break up, he's not happy, and at some point he wants to talk to her. He takes her by the arm, he pulls her into the car and says, we should talk. That's kidnapping. There's an act of violence there. He took her by force, by the arm. So, obviously, in this case, this man has some problems. And he needs to change his behavior. Absolutely. And it's absolutely important that he be punished in some way. But this lack of knowing how to behave in society, does that deserve 15 years in prison? You take this young man who's 18 years old because at one point he did something very stupid in a fit of anger. Are you going to put him in prison for 15 years for that? The sentence must correspond to the crime, and that is why we are fighting against mandatory minimum sentences. We have judges. Let them make judgments. They hear from the prosecution, they hear from the defense. In the case of the young man I was just talking about, well, there's not a lot of defense. But he can say, listen, I'm going to school. I'm going to do volunteer work. He might want to say, please don't ruin my life because one day I did the stupidest thing on earth. that doesn't merit a disproportionate prison sentence that will ruin my life. And the judge will say, look, you do need to be punished. But, rather, Mr. Speaker, not Mr. Judge, but Mr. Speaker, this bill deserves to be studied before committee. We should hear from experts who will appear, and it's important that we accept the fact that the messages that we hear from judges that mandatory minimum sentences are a big problem, at some point we're going to have to listen to those judges and act in consequence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Caribou Prince River, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a hard time understanding the NDP's sense of justice when it comes to sentencing for crimes that are committed, and they seem to blame the government, but in fact, Mr. Speaker, it is because the judges that sit on the benches in so many cases do not reflect the sentences they give do not reflect the severity of the crime. I'll give you a good example, and I know this one personally. Back in the year 2000, up till then, the sentence for killing while impaired was 0 to 14 years. The sentences were always in the 1 to 3 years. That got expanded to 0 to life in prison for where factors were present. You know what? The average sentence, Mr. Speaker, is still 1 to 3 years. No matter how many times someone had been convicted, suspended, and they're out driving again, they kill someone, they're still getting the same sentences. So something isn't being addressed here.
The honourable member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. I'm a little bit surprised to hear the statement from that member because self-intoxication is not a defense. If you kill someone because you are voluntarily intoxicated, that's premeditated murder. That's life in prison. And there the minimum sentence is 25 years. But that's a sentence saying that you have been put in prison for life. I'm not familiar with the exact case here, but self-intoxication is not an acceptable defense. And that's the Supreme Court that has said that in the case of a man who became intoxicated and killed a senior citizen. He said, I drank so much that I was in a state of mental illness, but that was not accepted as a defense. If you voluntarily intoxicate yourself, the acts that you commit during that time, you will be held responsible for. So I'm not familiar with the case that the member has mentioned specifically, and I'd be happy to discuss that case with him, but I know that voluntary intoxication is not an acceptable defense. Questions and comments, the honourable member for La Salle-et-Mar. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So I would like to thank my colleague, the honourable member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. Excuse me. I was getting my poets and my painters mixed up. It's Friday. So I have a question for my colleague. I've spoken on this government bill, Bill C-35, and we have been debating this bill for several days, for several hours. Well, we have a government omnibus budget bill where we have asked the government to split the bill so that we could discuss it in detail. Now, is there not a certain concern here that we're spending so much time to discuss a bill that, not without, and not to question the importance of this bill, but there's a sort of an imbalance here in terms of the priorities that we should have for this country, whether it be in terms of the economy, job creation, public services. And here we're discussing Bill C-35. I'd like to hear the comments of the honourable member on that. The honourable member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. The problem with omnibus bills, Mr. Speaker, is that they contain 20 or 30 bills in one. If we could discuss all of those individually, we could support them or reject them on a case-by-case basis. So in omnibus bills, even if there are good elements, we have to reject them because there are elements in the bills that are completely unacceptable. And that's the problem with omnibus bills and we go through them far too quickly. With the current bill, well, I'd like to have more bills like this that are more targeted. And I should also say that when I go door to door in my riding to speak with voters, you'd be surprised at how many Canadians have dogs and cats. There are even some who have serpents and lizards. But pets are very, very important. We give them a lot of importance. We are going to listen to all the experts here. Now, the problem here is not that we're giving too much importance to this bill, but the problem is that we're not giving any time to our omnibus bills before this House. And what happens all too often in this House is there's time allocation, and we have to vote far too quickly on 30 bills that have been very badly stuck together in one single bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, it's a great honour, as always, to stand in the House to represent the people of Timmins and the James Bay region as we deal with this Bill C-35, Quanto's Law. The bill to bring in mandatory minimum sentences for people who are mean to police dogs. And we spent a lot of time in this House talking about treatment of police dogs, and we've seen the government all sit together and they get very teary-eyed when they talk about the treatment of police dogs. It's about 7 years, almost to this week, that we stood in this House on another motion, Jordan's Principle, passed December 7, 2007, named after Jordan River Anderson from the Norway Cree First Nation, a young child who had never been able to go home because of his complex medical needs, and the federal government refused to pay for his health coverage unless he was in a foster care situation. And Jordan's principle was that all children, regardless of their race, in Canada have a right to equitable health care. And the House of Commons stood up, just as we'll probably stand up on Quanto's Law, and voted for Jordan's principle, and then nothing happened. I think when I was thinking of this bill on this police dog, I thought of Sergeant John O'Donovan of the Winnipeg Police, who on August 17, 2014 found the body of Tina Fontaine in the Red River. He told the media, "She's a child that's been murdered. Society would be horrified if we found a litter of kittens or pups in the river in this condition. She's a child." And it says something, Mr. Speaker, and this is nothing against dogs and cats. I've got dogs and cats at home. But when a police officer has to point out that a First Nation child who was murdered and dumped in a river, that it would have gotten more attention if she'd been a litter of puppies. So I want to just compare the values that we're seeing in this House in terms of mandatory minimum sentences. I'd like to read from you draft number 11, dated November 21st, 2012. It's entitled Jordan's Principle Case Conferencing for Case Resolution Federal Provincial Intake Form. It's tab 420 in the Factum of Evidence in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on First Nation child services that are being denied by the federal government. The quote is, "Previously healthy 4-year-old First Nation child suffered cardiac arrest and anorexic brain injury while undergoing routine dental extraction. The child is totally dependent for all activities of daily living and requires significant medical equipment before she can be discharged from health services." So those items that she needs, that they said, was a Hill-Ron bed for a child, a specialized stroller, a mattress to prevent skin breakdown, a trapeze bar, a portable lift, a bath frame, a Hoyer lift to look after this child and give her mother the support. There were over a dozen child welfare agencies looking at what needed to be done to get this child back with her family. And when it came to the bed that would keep her from suffocating, the specialized bed she needed, it says in the federal government notes that the non-insured health minutes of Health Canada said, quote, "Absolutely not." They weren't paying for a bed for a child who might suffocate otherwise. And we see in these notes resolutions that it was the director of the hospital who had to pay out of his pocket for this child to get a bed, because the government had written into their policy that providing that child a life-saving bed wasn't a priority. And yet here we are today talking about mandatory minimum sentences if you're mean to a police dog. I'd like to read to you another report dated Jordan's Principal Dispute Resolution, May 22nd, 2009. It's tab 320 in the factum of evidence that's been brought forward against the federal government. Quote, a child with multiple disabilities or complete medical needs requires a wheelchair and stroller and requires that a lift and tracking device be installed in their family home. Health Canada will provide the child only one of these items every 5 years. If the item is a wheelchair, non-insured health benefits support the provision of manual wheelchairs only, which must be fitted with special seating inserts in order to accommodate small children. They wouldn't even pay for an electric wheelchair for a completely incapacitated child. It's in the policy. And yet, here we are talking about mandatory minimum sentences for people being mean to police dogs. I'll read to you the internal government report from British Columbia, INAC and Health Canada Gaps in Delivery Services to First Nation Children in BC, dated November 6, 2009. Quote, more and more dentists and other care providers are refusing to deal with Health Canada because of long delays in payment. No funding for basic dental care, even in emergency situation. No money for, quote, basic equipment, e.g. hospital beds. We've already talked about that they won't pay for hospital beds for children. Too bad, so sad. No funding for special diets for children who can't eat solid foods. No funding so the guardian can travel with a child to a special needs appointment. Costs for certain medication. I'm not making this up. These are in the tabs. Costs for medication not approved by the federal government, even though the pediatrician has prescribed the medication for the child's condition. Quote, children are not accessing mental health services. If children cannot get necessary mental health, including assessment for fetal alcohol syndrome, they're unable to access other education programs. I can point out, Mr. Speaker, in my region of Treaty 9, the issue of not being able to access mental health services has left us with horrific levels of suicide, because if children or young people come forward and say that they're depressed or they're suicidal, the only option is to put them in foster care and take them away from their community. And any other community, they would provide counseling. But that's not allowed. It's not in the policy. And yet we've got mandatory minimum sentences being discussed today for being mean to police dogs. So I'd like to talk about this idea of mandatory minimum sentences. We have in the New Brunswick region an internal document, Education and Social Development Programs and Partnerships, dated November 2012, tab 298.
Member for Oxford is rising on point of order.
Mr. Speaker, there's got to be some relevance to the bill before the House. This member's been going on and on about issues that have nothing to do with Bill C-35, Quanto's Law, and it's certainly high time that he got back to the bill.
The member for Oxford raises the issue of relevance, and I have been listening carefully to the member from Timmins James Bay and have heard him make reference to the bill that is before the House, but is talking about other matters that may be related to it. It's the opinion of the chair that the member hasn't strayed beyond the normal practice of relevance to this point, but the chair is waiting to hear the member kind of bring this back to the matter specifically that is before the House. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Speaker, I know my colleagues certainly get upset any time we talk about First Nation children or First Nation victims in this House, but I was pointing out, as the member stood up, that I was referring back to Bill C-35 and the 6-month minimum sentence for abuse of police dogs, and I was comparing this to other government policies. So in Bill C-35, we're being asked to talk about invoking minimum sentences for mistreatment of police dogs. And yet, over on that side, the mistreatment of First Nation children under their watch, hey, too bad, so sad. New Brunswick Region Internal Document, Education and Social Development Programs, November 12, 2012, warns in 2 sections of the report of the risk, including death to children through underfunded child welfare programs. Quote, the continuance of inadequate service delivery could lead to the exposure of First Nation children to serious harms. Further, there would be a significant backlash if a child died as a result of funding not being available. Mr. Speaker, this House, in this last session of Parliament, I've seen it turn into a Potemkin democracy where important issues of the day are not allowed to be discussed, where they're pushed through an omnibus legislation, and that we have all the time under the sun to talk about the mistreatment of police dogs. And again, never support mistreatment of a dog or a cat. I've had dogs and cats my whole life. But when I see internal documents that say that this government knows that children are at risk of actual death because of their deliberate underfunding, and that this government would put in writing that absolutely not would we give the child the basic health care and a bed that that child needs so that child doesn't die, that they would write that into the policy, absolutely not. Well, then let's talk about minimum sentences. How about some minimum sentences for the people who have the fiduciary responsibility to look after children under their watch who leave them out with no support? The amount of children that we've seen who've been lost, given up, suffered death, suffered suicide, it is appalling. And so I will go back to the opening statement I made from Sergeant Donovan of the Winnipeg Police when he found the body of Tina Fontaine. She was an innocent child who had been taken out of her family and put in child welfare and then lost in the system. And he said if it was a litter of puppies or kittens, society would be appalled. And yet we see almost no response. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I was wrong. We have seen a response from the federal government. Their response from the federal government is to go after Cindy Blackstock, who brought forward the Human Rights Tribunal case, to spy on her, to follow her, to break the law in trying to get evidence on her, to fight these issues all the way through the Human Rights Tribunal. I'll end it on this one last case, Pictou Landing, Marina Beadle, whose son suffered from cerebral palsy, hydrocephalus, autism. The family fought all the way to Federal Court of Appeal just to get home care for this child. And this government wanted the family to pay medical costs, legal costs. That's the kind of situation we're dealing with, Mr. Speaker, in this House today.
Questions and comments? Questions and commentaires? L'honorable député de Gaspé.
The Honourable Member for Gaspésie-La-Madeleine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I listened very closely to the speech of my colleague. I find his viewpoint very refreshing. I think that it's a good idea to compare bills, that we're debating Bill C-35 today, but we need to compare it to other bills and penalties that we impose thereby. So is this bill, is it fair compared to some of the other bills that we're debating? Perhaps, well, we see that the penalties that are imposed under other bills here in this House of Commons are being appealed by numerous courts, and then the government has to redraft the bill because often the government goes too far with these bills, and the courts are telling them that. And I think so in many cases, the government should take the time to reflect and to properly debate these bills in committee and listen to experts, because this is a government that simply turns a deaf ear to experts. For this reason, I think that the viewpoint that my colleague has expressed is very interesting and refreshing. I would like my colleague to comment on the comparison between this bill and other enabling bills on the budget, for example. We whip through them in no time, whereas this bill, which targets a specific aspect, we're spending quite a bit of time on. Could he comment?
James Bay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an excellent question. We're in Parliament to review legislation and to ensure that the people of Canada, that when any bills are brought forward and become law, that they have received the full review so that we understand if there's problems, because bills, whatever they create, they can create unintended consequences. And yet we see under this government, serious pieces of legislation are blown through. There's time allocation. We're cut down on debate so that review isn't given. And we've had more and more bills rejected by the Supreme Court, bills that are unconstitutional, bills that even in the Senate they have to turn back because they're obviously failures. And that we could spend all day and weeks and months on a bill about being mean to police dogs. I'd like to point out to my colleague the example of the stripping of the Navigable Waters Act right across Canada. There was no review of that. That was so that they could get the pipelines through. And now we see in Ontario and Quebec regions the pushback on Energy East If the government had done this in a proper manner and reassured the public, there might not be this kind of resistance that we're seeing in Burnaby, that we're seeing in Northern Gateway, that we're seeing in Energy. So the lack of due diligence on these bills has huge implications for development in this country.
Questions and comments? Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's really with a great deal of disbelief that I listen to the members opposite complaining about how there's inadequate time to debate bills, and yet when given the opportunity to debate this bill, Quanto's Law, the opposite member just doesn't even speak about it. I listened very carefully to his comments, and I waited for him to talk about the sections of the bill that he liked or didn't like, and instead all I heard him talk about were other issues. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I think this contributes to a lot of the disillusionment across the land. When people tune in and they see these kind of antics, when they see a member such as the member opposite trying to distract people, trying to distract discussion from the matter at hand, when they see him wasting time talking about unrelated issues rather than the bill before us, I think people get very cynical about what goes on in this place. And quite frankly, I'd be interested to see if this member could stand on his feet and just for 30 seconds talk about 2 or 3 provisions of Quanto's Law.
The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Antics. Antics. Talking about Tina Fontaine's body being found in the Red River. But I guess because she was an Indigenous child to speak about the mistreatment of Aboriginal children in this House, this government thinks they're antics. Because they have absolute zero interest. They'd rather us talk about the treatment of police dogs because they have zero interest in the fact that under their watch, children are being denied wheelchairs. Wheelchairs is what they're being denied. You know why? Because there's 2 sets of laws in this country. One for the rich old white people and another for the Aboriginal children who are being denied hospital beds, denied access to dental treatment, denied access to medical services. And they say that when we raise issues of Indigenous rights, it's an antic. Damn right.
Be order. Before we resume debate, just the Chair would like to clarify for all members on the issue of relevance. There is a responsibility for members to address the matter that is before the House at any time. As has been said many times from this Chair, that a significant amount of latitude is given to members in terms of how they do that, including referencing other pieces of legislation or previous pieces of legislation. Having said that, this is not license for members to say, we have this matter before the House today, but I think we should be talking about another matter and then talking exclusively about that. So I just would urge all honourable members to keep the spirit of the principle of relevance central to their speech making, and for members to be tolerant of their colleagues who may choose a detour or a circuitous route to get to the point. But having said that, that only makes sense if and when the member actually does come to the point. That is how that is done. So this morning, this issue has been raised a couple of times, but I just want to remind all honourable members that the speech device, which is that we're talking about A, but I think we should be talking about B, and then talking for B ad nauseum, regardless of how the member may personally feel about issue B, is not really in the spirit of relevance. So with that, I anticipate that we will be able to carry forward with the debate today. The Honourable Member for Caribou Prince George on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I took a lot of exception to the member's use of the term rich old white people. And Mr. Speaker, it was the disdain in his voice when he uttered that. Now, he may not like rich people, he may not like old people, but that is no place for him to voice his disdain for that group is in the House of Commons, because this Parliament represents rich people and old people. And Mr. Speaker, if they happen to be one of the same, maybe they worked for it, but this member should be ashamed of himself for using that term in such a derogatory fashion. He should apologize, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay on the same point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, some people might consider me a rich old white guy, but so if I said anything derogatory, I retract it. But the fact is that there are 2 laws, and Indigenous children don't seem to matter with this government. But I will retract any unnecessary comments.
Thank you, and the chair appreciates that from the honourable member for Timmins James Bay. But in terms of the initial point of order raised, the standing orders also ask honourable members to conduct themselves in such a way in this place that they do not cause disruption. And there are times when members are quite passionate about what they say and say it in such a way that it incites passion. So again, I would urge members to be cautious in their choice of words and the way that they make the points, including when they are speaking about matters that they are very passionate about. Reprise de débat, l'honorable.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavik EU. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you very much for the reminder you have just given us. I might begin by saying that despite the comparison that's just been made between the treatment of Aboriginal children in this country by this government and the bill before us, I think it's really critical at this time to say that the NDP is against all cruelty to animals. That's something we've defended for a long time. And I think that this legislation, this bill, and other bills that we've tabled in the past have clearly demonstrated that. But it's also clear that every time there's a bill tabled by this government, and I would like to remind you again, that the devil is often in the details, as they like to say in English. And I'll come back to this during my speech. I know that the bill, C-35, which we have before us, is something we support. I want to say that as well. We feel it's important for that bill to be passed at second reading so that we can send it to committee for further study, because it's essential, it's critical to have the opinion of experts on some of the provisions of this bill. That's why the NDP, the official opposition, in this debate on this bill feels that it is important to send it to the committee for further study. But we also know that with the Conservatives, the devil is always in the details. It's a laudable effort in and of itself. I think that has to be recognized. And even myself, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you that I come from a generation of James Bay Cree in the north of Quebec, the last generation, in fact, who were really born in the forest, in tents, and who used dogs for their survival, sled dogs. And so I remember very well, Mr. Speaker, when I was young, and I was growing up, and we covered very long distances with sled dogs. And I remember that the very first thing, when we took a break after 4 hours with the dogs, there would be several sleds, not just one, because there were many members of the family. But the very first thing we did when we stopped to take a break and eat, my responsibility was to untie the dogs. That was the very first thing to do, because that is showing respect to the dogs, and doing so by freeing them from the harness and feed them before that we even would stop to have tea and feed ourselves. So that's the culture I come from, and I just want to remind that. Furthermore, as we talk about dog sled teams, I think it's important to remember that in the 50s and 60s, Mr. Speaker, the RCMP had a mandate, according to the Inuit, of massacring all of the sled dogs in the far north, including part of my riding, which is Nunavik. So they massacred the Inuit sled dogs in order to bring them back into the communities and make them follow their own agenda. So in 2011, Mr. Speaker, the government of Quebec had the wisdom to recognize the impact of this action taken by the government. In 2011, they apologized to the Inuit of Nunavik. And I know rather that in 2006 there was a report published on this in Parliament, and concern for the RCMP as well. They have some responsibility for their studies in that regard. But, Mr. Speaker, I was saying earlier on that it's important that this bill being sent to committee for study by specialists. And one of the reasons why I say that, Mr. Speaker, is that we're trying here in this bill once again to impose mandatory minimums and consecutive sentences, 6-month sentences as well. And this, as I said, is under C-35, an act to amend the criminal code, law enforcement animals, military animals, and service animals. One of the reasons why we feel that it must go to committee for this further study is indeed to invite the experts we need to hear from so they can tell us, for example, I'll take the example of the mandatory minimums. Experts could tell us in what way mandatory minimum sentences being imposed goes against several decisions handed down by the Supreme Court of Canada. I have 2 examples here. The first is in the Gladue decision, and you are no doubt aware of this important case that was before the Supreme Court. It's a decision that was handed down in 1999, in which we were discussing Section 23 of the Criminal Code, which talks about sentencing principles and what judges have to take into account when they determine an appropriate sentence for an offender. So it's an important decision on sentencing. And this kind of decision has to be taken into account. It's a Supreme Court ruling. It obliges courts and judges to take certain factors into consideration in determining the sentence that will be handed down, particularly if it concerns an Aboriginal person. And in the 1999 Gladue decision, the Supreme Court referred to this in 718.1 of the Criminal Code, requires judges to look at all of the sentences that might be applicable and to pay particular attention to the realities if it concerns an Aboriginal offender. So this is now part of case law. And there is, they have to look at restorative justice and take into consideration the over-representation of Aboriginal offenders in our prisons in their determining the corrective approach. So I'm not an expert in sentencing, Mr. Speaker, but I do know something about the law of this country, particularly when it's an issue of these kinds of Supreme Court decisions that I've taken the time to lead. When there are mandatory minimums that are imposed, we can see that it goes against this kind of order that's been handed down from the highest court in the country. So it's important to take that into consideration when we talk about mandatory minimums. The other example, Mr. Speaker, and I recall having referred to it in another debate in this House on another subject, and that was on the issue of murdered and missing Aboriginal women and girls. And I had quoted it in English at that time, but I'd like to refer to it in French today. And this is another important case. 1 minute? Okay. That concerns sentences. And I've come back to it, That's why it's important to have experts who come and tell us in what regard this is against the Supreme Court decision. In the other case, and I will conclude with this, that when they determine the sentence handed down to an Aboriginal offenders, the courts have to deal, first of all, with the history of the person, the residential schools, and all of these, all of the way this history affects these people today. That's important, Mr. Speaker, because the Supreme Court is dictating one direction that we must go into, and we seem to be going in another direction with this government's bill. So it's in that sense that I feel we must send this bill to committee for study, and so it can be looked at in more detail. Thank you. The Honourable Member for La Salle des Mares. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech, and particularly for reminding us of the importance, in fact, as has been noted with this bill, of what what services dogs can provide in different ways. And he also gave a very interesting example when he spoke about the customs and traditions of First Nations and the huge respect that First Nations have for working dogs, if I can put it in that way. However, I'd like to have his perspective on the time that we're taking to discuss this bill, whereas there are so many other issues. He raised a few, particularly in terms of First Nations and the treatment of members of First Nations, of their children, and other issues related to our economy. So I'd like him to expand on that, please. The Honourable Member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my colleague from La Salle des Mares for her question. I think that it's quite relevant. It's the nature of our work here in this House, Mr. Speaker, to discuss all the issues that come before us. You saw, Mr. Speaker, that I absolutely respected your reminder to really speak to the issue that we are discussing here today. But my colleague is quite right. Yesterday I was in Montreal before some 300 people to celebrate the graduation of some Cree firefighters, and most of them reminded me of what my colleague from La Salle des Mares just said. There are so many cases there are so many challenges that remain to be met for Aboriginal peoples here in Canada in 2014. I really find it unfortunate that we don't take more time than that to respect the First Peoples of this country. The Honourable Member for Brossard-la-Prairie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague who was very humble in terms of his knowledge in the matters of law. He's someone who has a great deal of experience in this area, and I'm not here to remind you of his qualifications, but when he talks about the importance or the impact that Supreme Court decisions have on how we must interpret the law and enforce it, I'd like to hear my colleague. I'd like to hear what he thinks when he sees government bills like this, whether it's private members' bills or government bills, how he sees the implementation of Supreme Court decisions, particularly when we're discussing mandatory minimum sentences. The Honourable Member for Nunavut, rather. It's a very relevant question because we're seeing more and more that bills that are passed here in the House under this conservative government, Mr. Speaker, we realize afterwards that they are rejected by the courts. And I don't need to remind you what happened in certain cases. But in my opinion, it's critical, once again, to remind everyone that parliamentarians, we have the obligation to consider the constitutionality of bills that we are studying here. The Minister of Justice, under Section 4.1 of the Justice Act, has the obligation. He has to consider if bills tabled in the House are charter-proof, for example. And I think that that's also valid for Aboriginal rights. Now, often, and I have to remind of this once again, when there are mandatory minimums that are set out in legislation, it seems that this has consequences on the judicial system and the prison system, but it seems as though, as people wanted to do at a certain point in time, they just want to build prisons. But we should be building houses for Aboriginal peoples in their communities.
Honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek. There's 5 minutes remaining in government orders this morning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to start off by commending you, because not often in this place does that happen. And your reminder about relevance in reference to the speech that was just given by the member from Timmins James Bay is very important, because in this place each one of us has aspects of our representation that we're oftentimes very passionate about. And in the case of the member from Timmins James Bay and the First Nations peoples that are in his riding, he's very concerned. And of course the striking comment from the police officer when they found that young Aboriginal woman's body, and when he compared it that the fact Canadians would be more concerned about puppies and that of course was a flashpoint for my friend from Timmins and James Bay. And I know you were attentive, Mr. Speaker, because you allowed that debate to go perhaps a little long, straying away from it, and he brought it back and with the comments that went on. But I appreciate the fact that you had the understanding of the passion, and I just wanted to commend you for that. It's not something that's usually done in this place. The other reason I think the frustration level for members on this side of the House, it's not that we're not supportive of bills and legislation to protect animals and service animals like the police dogs or the RCMP or Metropolitan Police Services or the horses or other animals. In fact, the NDP has supported bills in this House before, as I recall, C-232 and 592. But it's the fact that here we are, we're having a fulsome debate, which is more than reasonable, on this, following times where we've had far more complicated legislation before the House, where we've had time allocation forced on us over 80 times by my reckoning. And so once in a while that level of frustration will percolate to the top in the comments that we are making. And so I can understand my friend from Timmins James Bay when he expressed those concerns earlier. But I want to also commend the member for La Pointe d'Ile, the critic for the NDP, who reviewed Quanto's Law, or C-35, for us and offered recommendations on her thoughts to us. I may be able to bring a kind of unique perspective to this debate, Mr. Speaker, because in 1996 I was the chair of putting together, at that time, the largest civil demonstration in the history of our country in Hamilton. It was a protest, Mr. Speaker, against the Conservative government of Mike Harris at the time. We wound up with 105,000 people on the streets of Hamilton. And my point that I wanted to make, I had 28 years in the labour movement, and from time to time, either on picket lines or in various demonstrations, I've observed people who were taking part. Quite often were provocateurs outside of the activists that had put together the particular event. And I have seen on occasion where they had plans, for instance, to injure the horses of police officers with screwdrivers and implements like that. So I understand that when we're dealing with the use of service dogs and horses in crowd control and in those circumstances where sometimes there are people who who are very extreme. Now, in our case, in Hamilton in '96, we met with police services, fire service. I had individuals in charge of our security. We had 500 of our own marshals. And at that particular event, Mr. Speaker, we had about 40 activists, I won't call them activists, troublemakers, we'll use those words, who came with the intent of disrupting the event. And we were able to discuss the matter with them, with our own marshals, limit their activities to the point where they peacefully demonstrated. And so we can see in the end, Mr. Speaker, the importance of having some kind of reaction to the abuse or the killing of police service animals. And so we're in support of this going to committee. We do have some problems with the assignment of actual penalties where the judge doesn't get to make the decisions. We believe we put our judges on courts to guide us and lead us in law and to make those appropriate decisions. I see my time has ended, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Yes, well, the time for government orders has expired, and consequently, the honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek will have 5 minutes remaining for his remarks when this matter returns before the House. Déclaration de députés, statements by members. The honourable member for Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'm proud to rise in the House in celebration of the life of a true Canadian hero, Roy Henderson, who was a proud World War II vet, a member of the Royal Canadian Navy, passed away this week. Now, Roy was a true community volunteer and stalwart. Following his service in World War II, he joined the Canadian Legion. He was a volunteer fireman. He served a great career as an insurance salesman for Metropolitan Life. Now, Roy was always a strong supporter and loyal member of the Progressive Conservative Party of Nova Scotia and the Conservative Party of Canada. He was a key organizer during the Stanfield years for our party in my hometown of Truro. But what's more, he was a close family friend and someone I truly respect. So Tammy and I would like to give our condolences to the entire Henderson family on the passing of Roy. He had a tremendous life. He contributed to our entire community. God bless you, Roy.
The honourable member for Brassard-La Prairie. Last Sunday, Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to participate in the March for Peace, which took place in my riding of Brassard-La Prairie. I would like to congratulate the Brassard Islamic Center, Mr. Mohamed Yacoub, and all the organizers for the great success of this event. There were hundreds of people of all origins who came out in solidarity with our Muslim brothers and sisters. We were all shocked by the terrible events, Mr. Speaker, that took place in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and here in Parliament.
The leader of the official opposition, whether talking about protecting civilians in the Middle East, fighting racism and Islamophobia, or ensuring rights are respected here at home, New Democrats can be counted on to stand up for human rights. Moving forward, we will continue doing the hard work of ensuring Canadians' safety while guarding our shared values of freedom, tolerance, and an inclusive democracy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for York Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. For 2,500 years, Jews lived in Arab lands, but in the 20th century, many Arab regimes expropriated the property of Jews, stripped them of their citizenship, expelled, arrested, tortured, and murdered scores in some of the most vicious pogroms ever perpetrated against the Jewish people. Some 850,000 Jews were displaced. It is imperative that under international law, these people be determined to be refugees. Our own House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs agrees. In its report 2013, it declared Canada officially recognizes the experience of Jewish refugees who were displaced from states in the Middle East and North Africa after 1948. In Israel, a law has been enacted marking November 30th as the National Day for commemorating the flight of Jewish refugees from Arab lands. Across Canada and around the world, there will be events to mark this day. In 2013, Canada became the first country in the world to formally recognize Jewish refugees from Arab countries. I encourage nations around the world to follow our lead in recognizing this injustice. Under Prime Minister Harper's principled leadership, our country will stand proud and tall for the values that make Canada great: freedom, democracy, human rights, and
the honourable member for Cape Breton Canso.
Mr. Speaker, this week I was pleased to attend the Tourism Industry of Canada Annual Awards Night, where 3 organizations from my riding received nominations, including Cabot Links Golf Course, Fortress Louisbourg, and the Celtic Heart of North America Marketing Group. Congratulations to Cabot Links on winning the Visa Canada Traveler Experience Award. Cabot is recognized as one of Canada's top golf courses and ranked 82nd, ranked the 82nd best golf course in the world by Golf Digest magazine. Cabot Links runs along the breathtaking shoreline of Cape Breton and provides golfers with a true links experience with panoramic views, fabulous accommodations, and a 5-star menu. To the incredible Ben Cowan-Dewar and his wife Allie and their staff of almost 200, congratulations on this prestigious national award. Congratulations as well to the people of Inverness, and in particular, those members of the Inverness Development Association whose vision and determination were the impetus for this world-class project.
Right on.
The honourable member for Okanagan-Coquihalla.
Mr. Speaker, I have some exciting news to share with the House today. Stuix Resources is a tenure holder and forest management company owned jointly by 8 First Nations in my riding of Okanagan-Coquihalla. This is a company that employs close to half a dozen Aboriginal staff full-time and works with 89 different local businesses, of which 23 are local Aboriginal entrepreneurs. The company has replanted over 8 million seedlings in the past 5 years, and 65% of the forest harvest is completed by First Nation contractors. In summary, Stuix Resources has become a leader in First Nations forest resource management. I hope the House will join with me in recognizing Stuix Resources, who has won the Aboriginal Business Leadership Award presented by the Forest Products Association of Canada and the Canada Council for Aboriginal Business. This is an exciting award recognizing the leadership of First Nation communities and creating employment through responsible resource development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, in Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, I see many new citizens come into my office, and they want to invite members of their family for a simple visit to Canada. These people would like to share certain points in their life, like marriages, births, or other events with members of their family who are in their originating countries. However, when these people come from countries where there's a need for a visa, there's a huge labyrinth of administration to go through, and many citizens feel disoriented by the process, showing that there's a lack of resources available to them. At the end of an opaque procedure, requests are refused and citizens are left behind. These people feel discriminated against. They consider that they are considered to be second-class citizens by the Conservative government. I am calling for changes so that all citizens be treated equally. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary East.
Mr. Speaker, this Sunday 2 teams will go head-to-head in Vancouver. After a strong season, the Calgary Stampeders will face the Hamilton Tiger for Canadians' greatest prize, the Grey Cup. With the award-winning coaching of John Huffnagel and strong performances by players like Bo Levi-Mitchell and John Cornish, Calgary finished this season after winning an impressive 83% of their games. But, Mr. Speaker, Calgary's grit and determination means that our team won't rest until the job is done, even beating Edmonton to prove that they were the best in the West, Mr. Speaker. That's not enough. But to my dear friend, seatmate here, Mr. Speaker, I am telling him on Sunday we will beat you. Go, Stamps, go!
The honourable member for St. Catharines.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we'll all be watching and cheering on in celebration of the 102nd Grey Cup hosted at BC Place, where the Hamilton Tiger Cats will satisfy their fans, forever mark their spots in Canadian football history by capping off a Cinderella-esque year with a victory against the Calgary Stampeders. Despite pundits writing off the Hamilton Tiger Cats, including a member from Calgary East, there is no denying history will, as it always does, repeat itself. The last Ticats Grey Cup victory was against the Stampeders at BC Place in a comparable underdog manner. Regardless of any personal bias, I'm sure we can all look forward to an epic battle between 2 great teams. If nothing else, the 102nd Grey Cup will test the timely football law. Offense sells seats, defense wins championships. As Calgary's top offense will try their luck and fail against Hamilton's top defense, Oski wee wee, Oski 102.
Go, Stamps, go!
The honourable member for Compton-Stanstead. Mr. Speaker, I would like to bring to your attention some organizations that we often don't think of, but who are working tirelessly in Quebec with the help of volunteers and workers who are often paid very little. These groups are working to improve the quality of life for Canadians. Coopératives d'habitation de l'Estrie, which is working on social housing for low-income families. Centre d'Action Bénévole, which is working very hard. Les Amis de la Terre, which is helping with organic agriculture. L'Union Paysanne, which is defending traditional agriculture and family farms. COGESAF, which protects watersheds and water. Solidarité Rurale, which brings people together and speaks to the importance of rural life.
The Townshippers Association, protector of the Anglophone minority and its tradition, building bridges throughout our community.
The work that they are doing deserves our attention because their many initiatives are essential for all Quebecers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, under the Conservative government's family tax cut, every family with children will have more money to spend on their priorities as a family. The majority of the benefits will go to low and middle income families. For instance, a single mother with 2 children earning $30,000 per annum will benefit by a whopping $1,500 every year. But the Liberal leader is promising to reverse this tax relief and force hardworking middle-class families to pay more. We reject the Liberal leader's high tax policies. Our Conservative government has kept our promise to families, and we continue to stand with them. After all, Mr. Speaker, we all know that there are only 2 people who really know what's best for their kids, Mom and Dad.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Mr. Speaker, the co-op housing sector is in dire need of sustainable funding from the federal government because agreements between co-ops and CMHC are coming to an end. In my riding of Vancouver East, there are 30 housing co-ops. Approximately 1/3 of co-op households will be at risk of homelessness when these agreements expire. Thousands of vulnerable citizens will be burdened with severe financial difficulty. In an expensive city like Vancouver, the ability to secure affordable and stable housing is incredibly hard, and many are already spending so much on rent they are just one paycheck away from homelessness. Co-op housing occupies a vital and unique position because it is secure and affordable. The government has an obligation to ensure the ongoing success of the co-op housing sector by renewing federal housing assistance to low-income households and by building more co-op housing. I call on the government to recognize that affordable, adequate, accessible and secure housing like co-ops is a fundamental right for all Canadians.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Sault Ste. Marie.
Mr. Speaker, today StatsCan announced that our economy grew by 2.8% in the third quarter of 2014, well above market expectations. This is further evidence that our unprecedented focus on the economy is indeed working. In September, Canada exceeded economists' expectations by creating a whopping 74,000 jobs, and in October we surpassed forecasts again by adding another 43,000 jobs. Canada has created over 1.2 million jobs since the depths of the recession, but in an uncertain and dangerous global environment, many international risks and global market forces remain a threat to the prosperity of Canadians. Now is not the time for the risky Liberal Party tax and spend experiments. By contrast, our government's economic action plan is a proven success. We remain steadfast with our low-tax plan that is growing our economy and will bring us back to balance in 2015. Go Ticats! Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough-Agincourt.
Mr. Speaker, my spouse Jean and I recently had the pleasure in joining Warden Full Gospel Assembly in celebrating their 60th anniversary. As the Church reflects on its past, present and future, Warden Full Gospel Assembly represents the best of Canada. Dating back 60 years, the Church was first founded by a group of German immigrants who desired a spiritual home and a place of worship in their own language. Today, the Church's open doors has welcomed people from across the world while embracing and caring for a diverse group that is both multicultural and intergenerational. The Church's commitment and dedication to community have enriched the local neighbourhoods of Scarborough-Agincourt, whether it means running weekly sports program for young individuals or supporting the local food bank. I want to thank Warden Full Gospel Assembly, Pastor Trevor Moss, and the entire congregation for their ongoing commitment to community and wish them continued success in the years to come.
The honourable member for Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, our Conservative government is committed to combating terrorism. Despite the objections of the NDP, we have taken strong action to keep Canadians safe from those who wish to harm us. We thank our men and women in uniform serving Canada. That's why I'm concerned that the member from Scarborough Rouge River has made ridiculous statements equating Remembrance Day, which honours Canadian veterans, with Tamil Heroes Day, Mr. Speaker, which honours members of the terrorist organization known as the Tamil Tigers that have been killed. The NDP members should apologize immediately to veterans and to all Canadians, and they should start standing up with our government to protect Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have systematically and deliberately undermined and eroded the notion of ministerial accountability until it's only a facsimile of what it was intended to be. One graphic illustration is the refusal of the President of the Treasury Board to appear before the Standing Committee on Government Operations to defend hundreds of millions of dollars of proposed spending in the supplementary estimates. It's a fundamental principle of our parliamentary democracy that the government has to seek the consent of Parliament to spend money, and the notion of accountability dictates that the minister appears before the appropriate committee to make the case for any such spending, subject to scrutiny, oversight, due diligence, and thorough examination by its members. Mr. Speaker, you would well know that kings have lost their heads for failing to respect the supremacy of Parliament. The stubborn intransigence of this minister in refusing to attend a parliamentary committee shows an appalling disrespect for the institution, its members, and the Canadians they represent.
The honourable member for Ottawa Orleans.
Mr. Speaker, 100% of families with children in Ottawa Orleans and across Canada will have more money in their pockets because of our family tax cut and enhanced universal child care benefit. That includes two-income families, one-income families, and single parents.
The vast majority of benefits will go to low and medium income families.
Mr. Speaker, tax professionals agree. Caroline Batista of H&R Block says it's a great thing for families. Parents don't want the leader of the third party splurging their hard-earned dollars on risky liberal spending sprees, and we're right there with them.
We want to put money in the pockets of families and parents, not the government's pocket.
Orleans know best how to spend their money for their children, and I'm honoured to be standing up for them in this place and in the community.
Question orale, oral questions. The honourable member for Vancouver.
Week, the Auditor General blew the whistle on the Conservatives' pitiful record when it comes to helping injured veterans.
Hear, hear.
But adding insult to injury, we now learn the money they promised to veterans in a face-saving measure will actually be spread over not 5 years, but over 50 years. Conservatives misled the House, they misled the public, and misled veterans. Why won't the government own up to their mistakes and be honest with Canada's veterans?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the investment announced by our government will not only help today's veterans, Mr. Speaker, this will also help veterans of the future. When our government took office, Mr. Speaker, there were only 4 operational stress clinics, Mr. Speaker. We have already added 13 specialized military care facilities, Mr. Speaker, and our latest investment will add 8 additional operational stress injury clinics, Mr. Speaker. Across the country, we will continue to respond to today's veterans' needs, Mr. Speaker, as we move forward.
The honourable member of Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that answer is simply not accurate.
Hear,
While
hear.
the minister is failing to stand up and answer questions, his office confirmed yesterday that $159 million of the money announced will be spread over 50 years.
Unbelievable.
Mr. Speaker,
Unbelievable.
the Minister of Veterans Affairs ignored the Auditor General's recommendations from 2009, closed veterans' offices, targeted veterans who criticized him. After all that, did the minister really think misleading the public over this funding announcement would help him out?
Here, here.
Member Parliament Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure why the opposition is criticizing the investment that we're making to help Canada's veterans in mental health care cases, Mr. Speaker. We take veterans' mental health care very, very seriously, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly why we're introducing more clinics across the country, Mr. Speaker, more healthcare professionals across the country, Mr. Speaker, more places for veterans to get help, Mr. Speaker. We're expanding the access to treatment right across this country, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do that.
Honourable member for Vancouver East.
He said nothing about the 50 years. Now, the Minister of the Environment, the member for Nunavut, said in the House that stories about her constituents eating out of a garbage dump were, quote, untrue. But it did happen, as anyone who watches APTN can see. Can the Minister confirm that her office contacted Rankin Inlet and demanded they apologise for making public the fact that people in her riding are eating out of a landfill?
Arrogant.
The Honourable Parliamentary Senator Howe.
Mr. Speaker, the allegations are completely false. The Minister of the Environment was born and raised in the Arctic, and she knows how important access to healthy food is for our children and our families. The Minister was troubled when she heard these reports about families struggling to find food, and as the Member of Parliament for Nunavut, it's her responsibility to listen to the concerns of her constituents, to act on their behalf, and that's why she called her constituents to get the facts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi James and Nunavut EU. Because of the failure of the Conservative program seeking to lower the price of food, there's a food crisis in the north. Residents of Rankin Inlet are reduced to scavenging in the dump to feed themselves, but the only concern of the Minister of the Environment is to manage her public relations and demand apologies from the local authorities who denounce the situation. That's appalling. Does the Minister realize that the only thing that should concern her right now is that there are people in who are riding who are eating out of the dump and that she must help them?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister made a statement. She was troubled when she heard about the recent reports about families in Rankin Inlet struggling to find food, so she followed up with her constituents to address these concerns. She also contacted the senior administrative officer in Rankin Inlet to learn more about these concerns and reports, and at no time did she speak to the deputy mayor during this phone call conversation, and at no time did she or her office request an apology from anyone in the hamlet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Abitibi James and Nunavut EU. They have no shame, Mr. Speaker. They're the ones who created the mess with Nutrition North. Despite the $60 million that were invested, the price of fresh food has not dropped up north, and therefore dozens of people are reduced to scavenging in the dump to feed themselves. And the Minister of the Environment wants those who denounce this situation to apologize. This is absurd, Mr. Speaker. It is her who should apologize for this flawed program. Can this government create a program that actually works?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, the allegations are false. The truth is the results of our government actions are very clear. Nutrition North Canada has shipped a total of 61 million kilograms of nutritious and perishable food to northern communities since 2011. The Minister remains committed to working on behalf of her constituents to improve the program. For example, last week, the government announced an additional investment of $11 million in the 2014-2015 to improve the program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Markham Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, in response to the scathing report of the Auditor General, the Conservatives tried to mislead veterans and their families. They said that the $200 million that they promised for veterans would be spent over a period of 6 years. But we now know that these funds will be spent over a period of 50 years. 50, Mr. Speaker. How can the government defend such subterfuge?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we take not only mental health of our veterans very seriously, but also members of the Canadian Armed Forces, members of their families, Mr. Speaker. This is why we announced an investment last Sunday of 8 new additional Operation Stress Injury clinics, Mr. Speaker, the major one being Halifax and the other satellite offices right across this country. Mr. Speaker, this is in addition to 13 Operation Stress Injury clinics that we have already implemented since taking office. Under the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, there were only 4. There will now be 25, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, in its own press release, the government spoke of, quote, providing an additional investment of approximately $200 million over the next 6 years, end of quote, when in fact the investment is over 50 years. We know the government is ashamed of this paltry $200 million over 50 years attempt to mislead the veterans. Why else would the website announcing the program have disappeared from the Internet? How can the government explain these actions?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the reason we're investing millions of dollars into veterans' benefits and services and mental health is because this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we take the issue of mental health services very, very seriously when it comes to our veterans. Mr. Speaker, exactly why we're obviously putting more operational stress injury clinics right across this country, Mr. Speaker, more healthcare professionals, Mr. Speaker, more places for veterans and still serving members to get help, Mr. Speaker. We're expanding the treatments right across this country, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, we can clearly see how much this matters to the government. The Veterans Affairs Minister hasn't answered a single question, not one, all week. Once they got caught trying to deliberately mislead veterans, the Conservatives deleted the website announcing the program, and the minister's office went silent. How can Canadians and veterans trust anything this government says when they will clearly say anything to try and stop the damage?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we all know the record of the opposition when it comes to standing up for Canada's veterans, and any initiative our government bring forward, Mr. Speaker, to help Canada's veterans, the opposition has opposed, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to invest when it comes to veterans' benefits and services, and exactly the reason, Mr. Speaker, why last week we announced 8 new operational stress injury clinics right across this country, Mr. Speaker, so there are more places for veterans and their families to get the help that they need, Mr. Speaker.
Right on. The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. When Canada's veterans were asked to serve, they did so without hesitation. But later, when they need our help, this Conservative government is just walking away. The Auditor General was clear. Canadian veterans are not getting access to necessary mental health services in a timely manner. But apparently the minister thinks it's okay to take 50 years to fix the problem. Why are Conservatives trying to paper over their failure to support our veterans rather than fixing the problems?
Yeah. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we thank the Auditor General for his report, Mr. Speaker, and I want to point out the Auditor General recognized that Veterans Affairs does indeed, Mr. Speaker, have a robust health strategy in place, that we have put in place mental health support, and we provide rehabilitation to our veterans in a timely manner. Mr. Speaker, at the same time, the Auditor General did point out there were some unnecessary delays which the department or government is working to address, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the member makes it sound like it's some kind of detail in the Auditor General report that they just have to kind of fix. Not the case at all. That report was an indictment, a scathing indictment of the lack of care and compassion and services that our vets need. And it's time that they address the issues that are raised in the report, do it honestly, properly, and start with an apology to our veterans. Yeah. Where's the minister? Why isn't he here apologizing?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite can yell and scream all he wants, Mr. Speaker, but what the Canadian veterans and Canadians would like him to do is start standing up for Canada's veterans, Mr. Speaker, especially when it comes to standing up and voting in favor of the initiatives that our government brings forward, Mr. Speaker, such as the 8 new clinics that were announced just last Sunday, Mr. Speaker, that will go to help not only veterans but still serving members of their families, Mr. Speaker. Our government has a strong record, and we will continue to stand up for Canada's veterans this side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. John South, Mount Pearl.
Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. This is a minister who, rather than fixing the disgraceful record of his government on caring for veterans, chose instead to mislead Canadians about the mental health care they can expect to receive. He's literally run away from veterans and their families, while those who have served our country face a mental health crisis of unprecedented proportions. Mr. Speaker, why are the Conservatives more interested in covering up their shameful treatment of Canada's veterans than in actually helping our veterans?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General clearly said that Veterans Affairs has put in place important mental health supports, Mr. Speaker. Access to mental health support under the rehabilitation program is timely, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, we accept all recommendations put forward by the Auditor General, including where he suggested that there are some unnecessary delays in the paperwork and the application process, Mr. Speaker, that we will address that, and the department is already working on those initiatives, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. Jean. Mr. Speaker, the attitude of the Conservative government toward our veterans is unacceptable. On Sunday, the minister announced with great fanfare a program of $200 million for the mental health of our veterans. Now that's great, but today we learned that this program will spread out over a period of 50 years. 50 years. Once again, this government is telling our veterans tall tales. So why doesn't the minister understand that our veterans need mental health care now, not in 50 years?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we're not only responding to the veterans' needs when it comes to today's veterans, Mr. Speaker, we're also responding to the needs of the veterans in the future, Mr. Speaker. Exactly as I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, there were only 4 operational stress injury clinics when our government took office, Mr. Speaker. We have already put in place 13 operational stress injury clinics across the country, and just last Sunday we announced 8 additional, Mr. Speaker, satellite offices across this country, the major one being in Halifax, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to stand up for Canada's veterans.
The honourable member for Manicouagan. Instead of accepting the findings of the Auditor General that the Nutrition North program is a failure and acting to help the people in her own riding, the Minister of the Environment instead demanded an apology from the Rankin Inlet authorities, who revealed that between 50 and 100 people are scavenging in the dump to find food. She should be ashamed. Will the government admit that it has failed to act on this crisis and pledge to change the program to help the northern public who are paying too much for food?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government wants Northerners, like all Canadians, to have access to quality and nutritious food. That's why we created the Nutrition North program. The member knows that. The results are clear, Mr. Speaker. Since the program began, shipments of healthy foods to our north have increased by 25%, and savings for families have been on average $110. We're increasing funding, Mr. Speaker. We're improving this program to make sure that all Canadians have access to healthy food.
The honourable member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, close to 100 people are forced to go to the landfill to find food in the north to survive. The price of food is astronomical. Some fresh food costs 10 times more than down south. But instead of reaching out to them and doing everything she can to fix this problem, all that their own member is doing is to intimidate them. That's unacceptable. Can the government tell us, since when it has known that the citizens of Rankin Inlet have been scavenging through the dump to find food, and what it is doing to fix this crisis?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's rather quite shameful that the member from Churchill is using unfounded, untrue personal attacks when she should be talking about the importance of the Nutrition North program, which has provided areas like hers with a 25% increase on shipments of healthy food, Mr. Speaker, and average family of 4 has seen their grocery bill go down. That is why we created the program, Mr. Speaker. We've committed new funding just this week. Ongoing improvements are in place. This is an important program and not the time for unfounded attacks.
The honourable member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, what is truly shameful is that people in my part of the country continue to go to Hungary because Nutrition North is not working for them the way it's not working for northern people across our country. And as for the people of Rankin Inlet, they deserve more than intimidation and empty rhetoric from this government. We should be doing everything we can to ensure that nobody in the north has to go to the dump to get food. And we need to get to the bottom of the demand that the minister made to Rankin Inlet officials. When did she ask her office to apologize to them? Was this a directive to the PMO? And do they truly believe that that's how northern people deserve?
The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my previous response, the member knows that this program is working. The Auditor General said it can be improved, and you will see improvements, Mr. Speaker, that make sure that retailers are a part of a solution for northern families. But already we're seeing a net benefit of over $100 per family. This week, an additional $11.3 million was added to the program, Mr. Speaker. This is a time to make sure Northerners know about the program. We work with retailers to make sure it's having its impact. It's not the time for shameful attacks.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Cowichan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about a respectful relationship, we mean respect, dialogue, reconciliation, and clearly the Minister of Environment does not share this definition. So we've asked a number of simple questions. So once again, when was the Minister aware that 50 to 100 of her constituents had to resort to a landfill to feed themselves? Why was there no immediate action? And when was the decision made to attempt to strong-arm the officials in Rankin Inlet rather than reaching out a helping hand to help them out?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for National Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, as the Parliamentary Secretary earlier indicated, those reports are untrue. The Minister, as member for Nunavut, is constantly in touch with her community on all reports, Mr. Speaker. In fact, rather than just rhetoric that's being thrown by some of those members, Northern Canada has had the strongest member in Cabinet in its history, Mr. Speaker. There is no stronger champion for the North, somebody delivering results, not petty and shameful attacks.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, welcome to Conservative Canada, where if you're a vet, you wait 50 years, and if you're hungry, you go to the dump. Now, this week, when Canadians saw heartbreaking footage of people scavenging in dumps and Rankin Inlets, the Conservatives went on the offensive. This minister claimed that this video wasn't true. We heard her staff intimidated people in Rankin Inlet, demanding an apology to the Conservative Party of Canada. What staggering indifference. I'd like to ask the minister why she believes that people eating out of dumps in her riding owe the Conservative Party an apology for her failure to represent them.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing found in dumps here this morning are the questions and the approach of the opposition, Mr. Speaker. This is a time where we could be talking about how the Nutrition North program is helping families in the North. We're hearing that, Mr. Speaker. The minister is in touch regularly with her communities. She represented the territory on the ground, Mr. Speaker. She was raised there. She's not just reading attack lines in the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker. She's delivering for Northern Canada, and we're very proud of that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Vancouver Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General slammed this government for failing to address the high cost of food in Canada's north. There's evidence that to survive, people have to scrounge for food in the dump. Yet the Minister for the North continues to deny this. What's worse, elected officials say she's been bullying them to endorse her failed program and apologize to the Conservative Party. This is shameful. This is not the first time the Minister for the North has failed the North. Will she listen to the AG and act now to ensure that the people of the North have access to nutritious and affordable food?
Good question. The Honourable Parliament Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, the government wants to ensure that Northerners have the same access to healthy food that constituents like mine have, Mr. Speaker. That's why we created the Nutrition North program, and it's seen good results. Since 2011, Mr. Speaker, there's been a 25% increase in shipments to the North of healthy food products. An average family of four has seen a net reduction in their grocery bill of $110. Mr. Speaker, Northern Canada, since this minister has been a part of the federal cabinet, has never been better served. She's a champion for the North and for all of Canada, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General's report says Nutrition North is a mess. The Minister of Aboriginal Affairs agrees with the Auditor General. The MLA for Joe Haven says the program is not working. The Deputy Mayor for Rankin says that residents are scavenging in the local dump for food. Yet the minister in charge of this particular area says it's all not true and demands an apology. So what's not true, Mr. Speaker? That the AG's findings, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs' agreement with the AG's findings, the MLA's statement for Joe Haven, the Deputy Mayor for Rankin.
Or the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, nothing indicates the experience that the minister brings than the fact that she was previously the MLA for Joe Haven. In fact, she grew up and is from Nunavut, Mr. Speaker. She brings that passion and that knowledge to the House. She's not just reading lines on a piece of paper, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
The reality is the Auditor General knows that more money is being spent, there are results, and we're going to ensure that we take the Auditor General's feedback to ensure that there's more clause in these funding agreements to ensure recipients can provide all information on eligible items, including margins, to make sure that the net benefit is for the families of the North.
Here. The Honourable Member for Scarborough-Agincourt.
Mr. Speaker, this government's blind slashing of budgets is having a profound effect on Canada's tourism industry. Since coming to power, this government has chopped the budget of the Canadian Tourism Commission by almost half. 2 years ago, the Commission pulled out of its biggest market, the U.S., due to these cuts. Now, even the minister is suggesting that this was a mistake and is asking for help from the Prime Minister for greater funding. Mr. Speaker, when will this government listen to its own minister and restore funding to the Canadian Tourism Commission?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary for Industry.
Mr. Speaker, of course our government is delivering concrete actions for the Canadian tourism sector. We have introduced more efficient electronic visa application processes. We've negotiated and expanded nearly 80 air transport agreements since 2006. We're expanding our visa application centres to 130 worldwide, and we're promoting Canada in key tourism markets around the world. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Tourism Commission will continue to promote Canada as a welcoming four-season destination in the world's most promising tourism markets.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie.
Hans Morin's unofficial job at SNC-Lavalin was to give illegal donations to political parties. It's not just an accusation, he admits it. Conservatives have known about it for 18 months. And what did they do? Nothing. Yes. Morin remained in his conservative patronage position at the Port of Montreal, getting $25,000 a year until CTV revealed the scam. And so only now he's out. Why did it take so long?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary for Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, this individual is no longer a member of the board, and none of the issues regarding his alleged activities at SNC-Lavalin are related to the federal government, but anyone found responsible for that wrongdoing should face the full force of the law.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. That's very reassuring. A former vice president for SNC-Lavalin admitted to the anti-corruption unit that he was at the heart of a slush fund to the benefit of the Liberal Party of Quebec. Thanks to the nominee system, SNC paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Liberal Party of Quebec.
And despite these revelations, this man was able to sit for another 18 months on the board of the Port of Montreal. Why did the Conservatives turn a blind eye to the illegal actions taken by this VP of the Port of Montreal for all this time? Mr. Speaker, this person no longer sits on the board. None of the issues concerning his presumed activities with SNC-Lavalin are tied to the federal government. Whoever is found responsible for illegal actions has to face the law.
Parkdale Hyde Park.
Mr. Speaker, Canadian steel companies and workers are being shut out of opportunities because of this government's failure to do anything about creeping Buy America policies. Now a ferry dock project in Canada on federally owned land is closed to Canadian steel companies.
Unacceptable.
Canadian workers and businesses are looking for more than concern from this government. What is the minister actually doing to correct this situation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, as the minister indicated in this House earlier this week, our government's deeply concerned by the appearance that the U.S. intends to apply Buy American restrictions to the project at Prince Rupert. This is just another example of how illogical and actually counterproductive to free trade these Buy American programs are. Our government has a track record of consistently opposing such measures and standing up and opening markets for Canadians. We will continue to work on that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Mr. Speaker, it's reached the point that the Buy America Act is enforced on Canadian soil. Canadian steel producers cannot even bid on the port that's being built in Prince Rupert in Canada. During this time, Canadian workers, like those at Nova Bus in Saint-Eustache, are the victims of Americans' protectionist policies. Why can the Conservatives not even protect Canadian jobs?
Mr. Speaker, as that member on the Trade Committee well knows, our government has consistently stood in opposition to such protectionist measures. What's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is that her colleague, the Member of Parliament for Burnaby New Westminster, has been promoting such measures, Mr. Speaker, calling them perfectly logical, as they're trying to actually oppose the 1 in 5 jobs being created in Canada attributable to trade, Mr. Speaker. There's no party in this House that stands up more for opening markets for Canada and protecting our own access than this government, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Okanagan-Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, in September, the Canadian economy beat market expectations by creating over 74,000 jobs. Last month, we surpassed expectations again by adding another 43,000 jobs. With 1.2 million new jobs created since the recession, the Canadian economy is envied around the world. Could the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance please update this House on the latest news about Canada's economy?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the member from Okanagan-Shuswap for that excellent question. I am pleased to report that the Canadian economy grew at an annualized rate of 2.8% in the third quarter of 2014, crushing market expectations. But as we have seen, global market forces affect Canada, and the global economy remains fragile. Now is not the time for risky Liberal Party tax and spend experiments. We must stay the course with our low-tax plan that is growing our economy and will bring us back to balance in 2015.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Last October, 34 compensation professionals from Health Canada and Shawinigan were dismissed. Their jobs were transferred to New Brunswick. For the Mauricie region, this represents a loss of $1.5 billion in direct benefits, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with these workers who are still hoping to be able to work in the federal public service in the Mauricie. Will the minister at least attempt to integrate them into federal offices in Shawinigan?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, our government made a commitment to taxpayers that we would run this government in a much more responsible way when it came to how we spend their dollars, and we would improve service delivery for them. Mr. Speaker, our consolidation of services includes streamlining, increasing accessibility, and making sure that as we do that, we offer the employees every opportunity to continue work with the federal government.
Well said.
The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, I can't help myself but reminding them that the abandonment of regions is now policy. The Mauricie region was already negatively impacted by the Conservatives' bad management. Wood processing is stalled and the manufacturing industry is slowing down, and the CBC has suffered the impacts of the government's ideological cuts. Moreover, the closure of the Health Canada office in Shawinigan is affecting 34 jobs and represents $1.5 billion in losses. Can the minister commit to relocating these employees into the federal public service in Shawinigan in the regions where we need jobs? Mr. Speaker, our government made a promise to Canadians to respect the dollar for taxpayers, and that's why we are modernizing systems and providing services to Canadians. We want things to be more effective and efficient. All employees will receive or have already received offers to help them to continue to work with the federal government.
The honourable member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Well, Mr. Speaker, every day I'm hearing complaints from my constituents in Stony Creek who are troubled by the heavy-handed tactics of Canada Post when they're deciding where to locate the new super mailboxes. Canada Post representatives show up on their doorstep not to consult or hear feedback, but to tell them that their lot has been chosen for the box. If they have complaints, they're sent to a 1-800 number where they're told that it is a final decision. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have failed to protect mail delivery in this country. Now will they at least intervene and ensure a respectful consultation process rather than what Canada Post is giving?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary for Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, as the member knows, that Canada Post is an independent arm's-length Crown corporation responsible for executing its 5-point plan, Mr. Speaker, in order to turn around the finances of the company, but also to ensure that there is daily mail for all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, they are doing so in a way that tries to assess the needs of those in their particular communities, potential challenges, Mr. Speaker. They're engaged in several communications within the constituency, Mr. Speaker, but if there's a particular question, I will refer the member to Canada Post.
The honourable member for Laval. Since the government took the decision to do away with home mail delivery, the people of my riding are angry, and with reason. The most elderly people and those with mobility issues will be the first affected. And yet, Canada Post has made profits of $84 million since the beginning of the year. Mr. Speaker, why do the Conservatives want to cut an essential public service to the citizens of Laval?
Correct the record, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative government has done no such thing. Canada Post, as an independent Crown corporation, is responsible for the 3 years of losses, Mr. Speaker, that have been piling up. That's because 1.2 billion fewer letters are being delivered in 2013, for example, than they were in 2006. Mr. Speaker, they have an obligation to be financially sustainable and not a burden to taxpayers. We expect them to do so, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Mount Royal.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate Maitre Suzanne Cote on her nomination to the Supreme Court. I remain concerned, however, that yet again the government has gone about filling a Supreme Court vacancy with a closed, unaccountable, unrepresentative approach.
That's not right.
With no selection panel, no parliamentary, and no public participation. In 2004, in concert with Parliament, I implemented a series of reforms that made the appointment process more transparent, inclusive, and accountable. 10 years later, the Conservative dismantling of that process is apparently complete. What steps, if any, will the government take to reverse this regression, respecting thereby Parliament?
The Honourable Parliament Secretary for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As that member will know, the last time an all-parliamentary process was used in the selection of a Supreme Court justice, there was a serious breach of confidentiality, and we are continuing to review the process for future appointments. Now, a former Liberal Justice Minister said a high degree of confidentiality is required for the process to function properly. You know who said that, actually, Mr. Speaker? it was him when he was Minister of Justice.
The honourable member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Mr. Speaker, the situation right now in my riding is very dire for a community of Change Islands. On Change Islands, they have the potential to have a fantastic operation in their fish plant, and success is near. The problem is the adjacent wharf. On the wharf itself, it's been deemed unsafe, unfit, and now an impediment to any success that may be to them from the fish plant. So I ask the Minister, please assess the situation with the wharf. They manage it. Get in there, assess the situation, and put some investment in that wharf for the community of Change Islands.
Honourable Parliament Secretary for Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. In recent years, our government has made unprecedented investments in small craft harbours across Canada. In fact, just this week, the Prime Minister announced another $288 million in additional funding for small craft harbours across Canada. We're very aware of the situation at the Change Islands Wharf and the importance to the community and the need to reconstruct the wharf. An engineering assessment is being undertaken to determine what can be done in preparation for the next fishing season. So we've identified this as a future project and looking forward to getting the work done.
The honourable member for Thunder Bay, Rainy River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people in my region rely on FedNor, but I was shocked to learn that the total lapse spending at FedNor, money that was approved by Parliament but not utilized, is in the millions of dollars. Last year alone, the Conservatives spent $7.5 million less than planned on FedNor's main fund. Given our economic challenges in Northern Ontario and the need for development at the Ring of Fire, here's an easy question. Why did the minister return the money approved by Parliament to the Treasury?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, our government is focused on community economic development, business growth, competitiveness, and innovation that creates jobs and long-term prosperity. We will continue to ensure that communities and businesses in Northern Ontario have the tools they need to have a strong, diversified economy. We are working with all levels of government, including First Nations and other stakeholders, to ensure we maximize the economic opportunities and long-term sustainability of Northern Ontario.
The honourable member for La Salle-Mar. Since 2011, there have been three incidents involving trains in southwest Montreal. The latest derailment a few months ago involved 4 cars containing hazardous materials. The president of the Transportation Safety Board requires more robust tank cars and is worried that the government is not doing enough to discipline transporters. When will the government listen to the Transportation Safety Board and watch over the safety of rail transport? People are worried. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Security Canadians is a top priority for Transport Canada, and that's why they have taken a number of very important actions with respect to rail safety. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, as we vowed we would, the most offending DOT 111s have been removed from the service of transporting crude. The remaining DOT 111s are on an aggressive phase-out, Mr. Speaker, that will finish ahead of a proposed American standard for a phase-out. We have gazetted regulations for new enhanced standards for tanker cars, and we continue discussion with the United States on what the next replacement car will look like. We continue to act, Mr. Speaker, because safety is important.
The honourable member for Medicine Hat.
Mr. Speaker, recently the member for Scarborough Rouge River stood in this House to celebrate Tamil Heroes Day, which is a day that marks the death of terrorists fighting for the Tamil Tigers. I say terrorists very deliberately, as our Conservative government listed this organization as a terrorist entity in 2006. Could the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety please tell this House whether she thinks it's appropriate to compare deaths of terrorists to the deaths of fallen Canadian soldiers, as the member for Scarborough Rouge River did, and can she tell us what our government is doing to combat terrorism?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank that member from Medicine Hat and for his previous work on the Public Safety and National Securities Committee. Mr. Speaker, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, known more commonly as the Tamil Tigers, was listed as a terrorist entity by this Conservative government in 2006, and rightfully so. I am shocked that anyone would equate this day dedicated to the glorification of the terrorist group Tamil Tigers to the solemn occasion of Remembrance Day, where we honour our fallen Canadian heroes. We urge the NDP to stop shopping for votes from terrorist-linked groups and to immediately apologize to veterans and all Canadians for the comments made by
the Honourable Deputy.
The Honourable Member for Saint Maurice Champlain. Mr. Speaker, last month we learned of the loss of federal public service jobs, 34 of them in Shawinigan. These job losses at Health Canada are in addition to a long list of job losses that the Mauricie region has suffered, including some in the metalworking and forestry sectors. Does the minister responsible for these job losses plan to change this decision, given the economic reality of the region? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we made a commitment to respect taxpayers, and that's why we are streamlining our systems to provide service to Canadians. That means there will be computer systems, there will be some consolidation, and Mr. Speaker, I can assure you that any employee who, or rather will receive help to continue to work for the federal government.
La Fédération professionnelle des journalistes du Québec a demandé au Premier ministre de clarifier sa position à l'égard de Radio-Canada.
Sorry. Testing. 1, 2 is testing. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. The insinuations and threats by Carl Vallée, the Prime Minister's press secretary, sent to the news director of Radio-Canada are not acceptable. These words, these comments, undermine the editorial independence of Radio-Canada and raise doubts about the freedom of information under the Conservative regime. How can the government claim that Radio-Canada is independent when the Prime Minister's office interferes in programming?
Mr. Speaker, those allegations are completely untrue. The CBC Ombudsman was very clear on this matter. With respect to this documentary, the Ombudsman found the rules of journalistic standards and practices had not been correctly applied. We respect the Ombudsman's finding, so should the member.
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Quinte West.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we stand up for women and girls, and we're taking action to protect them from being victims of barbaric cultural practices. On the other side of the House, the leader of the Liberal Party refuses to take a strong stance against violent acts that put immigrant women and girls at risk. Will the Parliamentary Secretary for Citizenship and Immigration please explain what this government is doing to help protect Canada from gender-based violence?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Citizenship.
Mr. Speaker, this week the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, stated, and I quote, "We must advocate with governments for child marriage to be prohibited by law and for this to be effectively enforced." Our Conservative government is doing just that, Mr. Speaker. We are strengthening our laws to ensure that no young girl or woman in Canada becomes a victim of early forced marriage, polygamy, honor-based violence, or any form of harmful cultural acts. On this side of the House, we are taking strong stance against these practices, and we look forward to support from all members in the House when the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act is...
The Honourable Member for Jonquière Alma. Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate is now at least 40%. Families, their regions, and their regions are abandoned. It's a disastrous record under the Conservatives. More than 6 unemployed out of 10 do not have right to benefits, not eligible. It's unacceptable. Why is the government abandoning these workers, and why is it not coming to their assistance to improve eligibility for EI?
Mr. Speaker, the changes we've made in employment insurance do nothing to limit access to employment insurance. So if you lose your job due to no fault of your own, the employment insurance system will be there for you just as it always is. That's what it's there for, Mr. Speaker. We're supporting unemployed Canadians getting back to work.
Absolutely.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière Alma. Mr. Speaker, over the next 3 years, the government will plunder the EI fund to the tune of $14.2 billion. That's more than $4.5 billion per year. Rather than making it an employment tax, why does the government not come to the assistance of the unemployed with their own money?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, unlike what the opposition would do, this government believes that employers and employees who contribute to the program have the right to have premiums either stay the same or actually get lower. That's why we treat the Employment Insurance Fund with respect, unlike the previous government who rated it for over $50 billion, Mr. Speaker.
Terrible.
Canadians can count on us not to do that and keep in support of all Canadian workers and employees and contributors like the employers across this country. We're defending the EI system, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Richmond Arthabasca. Mr. Speaker, the agreement ratified yesterday at the WTO opens the door to negotiations on market access, which includes supply management. The Minister of International Trade, who's always on the fast track and in a hurry to sign agreements, has to take into account the warning issued this week by Bruno Le Tendre, the president of Quebec Dairy Producers, who reminds that dismantling the supply management system would cause prices to plummet for producers and result in bankruptcies. Will the minister be clear with his counterparts for the next steps and protect supply management, contrary to what he has done with the Canada-Europe Agreement and what he's preparing to do with the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Parliamentary Secretary, thank you. The dairy producers and can know that they can continue to count on our government to defend their interests. We ensure that all pillars of the supply management system remain intact in all trade agreements that our government implements, including those with Europe and Korea. We're working and taking tangible steps to manage imports to Canada in these areas. Our government has always defended the supply management system and will continue to do so. Thank you.
This concludes question period for today. I understand the honourable member from Caribou Prince George is rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the member statement period, the member from Winnipeg Centre, like his colleague from Timmins-James Bay, displayed his contempt for how we are to behave in this House. In his member statement, he opened by making references to kings losing their heads, and then went on a tirade directed to the President of the Treasury Board. Following his SO31, he sat down and immediately made slashing gestures across his neck to his colleagues. Mr. Speaker, that was an appalling display, and given the time of this world that we're living in, I think the member probably regrets that and wants to make an apology for that, Mr. Speaker.
Is the honourable member rising on a point of order as well? Honourable member for Timmins-James Bay and point of order.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I take my work very seriously in the House, and I was shocked that as I do my work, I get some drive-by smear about something to do with kings and the Treasury Board. I haven't spoken ever on kings. I have lots of opinions on the uselessness of the historic monarchy, but I don't know why I'm being subjected to this smear. I'd like the member to apologize.
The chair will take this under consideration and return if necessary. The honourable member from Medicine Hat on the same point of order?
Yes, I actually saw the member from Winnipeg Centre do the same thing as described by my colleague here, and I think it is definitely deplorable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The chair appreciates the point raised and will, as I said, review the matter and return if needed. The honourable member for Hamilton Centre on a different or the same point?
Point of order arising from statements prior to the question period. I rise on a matter of serious importance in terms of misleading this House. The member for Calgary East stood and said as a fact that the Calgary Stampeders are going to win. They aren't. The Ticats are. Would you please call on that member to correct the record?
The chair presumes that this matter will resolve itself on Sunday. Tabling of documents, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I have the honour to present the official languages is the 8th report of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, entitled Supplementary Estimates B 2014-2015. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages a 6th report of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates in relation to its study on Supplementary Estimates B 2014-15.
Apologize, I believe we jumped the agenda here a little bit. I was at the point of tabling of documents which the Parliamentary Secretary had done. Next, going to introduction of government bills, statements by ministers, reports from interparliamentary delegations, presenting reports from committees. The
for my committee, instead of Mr. Member down there, the chair of that committee is in fact president. If anybody's going to present a report for that committee, I'll do it.
Order. Just if I could proceed. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Employment and Social Development, presenting a report from committee.
Speaker, I made an error before. I thought you were calling me to make my presentation of our committee report, so I will. It's already been presented to the clerk. I hope you can take it in at this point.
Sorry. We seem to be just a little discombobulated here, and I apologize if part of that's for me. There is a process in terms of presenting reports from committee, and we will make our way through this. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Employment and Social Development, does he have a committee report?
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 8th report on the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, entitled Supplementary Estimates B 2014-2015.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 9th report of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights in relation to the study on the Supplementary Estimate B 2014-2015. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting reports, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 6th report from the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, entitled Supplementary Estimates B 2014-15, Vote 5B under the Offices of the Information and Privacy Commissioners of Canada, and I report that the committee has examined in a very thorough and comprehensive way the supplementary estimates put forward by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner and voted on division to approve and recommend adoption of proposed spending found therein. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just point of clarification with the Honourable Member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills, if it is his intention to table the 6th report, that has already been done by the Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre. Presenting reports, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to table in both official languages the 26th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs in relation to a study of the Supplementary Estimates B for the fiscal year 2014-2015.
A few moments ago, when the Chair called for the tabling of documents, I believe that the translation picked up the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Was that in fact what the Parliamentary Secretary for the Government House Leader on tabling of documents?
That, Mr. Speaker, I think there was probably a confusion. There's two people speaking at one time. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 36.8, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's responses to 4 petitions.
Presenting reports, the Honourable Member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills.
I'll give it a try again. Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages a 6th report of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates in relation to its study on supplementary estimates 2014-15.
Presenting reports from committees. Introduction of private members' bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Presenting petitions. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to rise today to present a petition signed by literally tens of thousands of Canadians who call upon the House of Commons and Parliament here assembled to take note that asbestos is the greatest industrial killer that the world has ever known. They point out that more Canadians now die from asbestos than all other occupational or industrial causes combined, and yet they also note that Canada has never banned asbestos and continues to promote its use in this country. And therefore, these petitioners call upon the Government of Canada to ban asbestos in all of its forms and institute a just transition program for asbestos workers in the communities they live in, to end all government subsidies of asbestos both in Canada and abroad, and to stop blocking international health and safety conventions designed to protect workers from asbestos, such as the Rotterdam Convention.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Social Development.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to stand here today and present a petition from hundreds of Canadians to introduce legislation to amend the Criminal Code of Canada to include torture committed by non-state actors, private individuals, and organizations as a specific and distinct criminal offense. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Churchill.
Petitions on behalf of my constituents in Flin Flon and Thompson, as well as Canadians from Saskatchewan and Alberta, who are all calling on the federal government to change course, protect home delivery, and protect our postal service, which is an integral service to all of our communities across this country. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for... I would like to present this petition calling for the respect of the rights of family farms to keep and exchange and use seeds. The petitioners in my writing are calling on the Government of Canada and the House of Commons to commit to adopting policies for international aid that will support small farms, and particularly women, to recognize their indispensable role in the fight against hunger and poverty, and also that it commit to ensure that policies and programs put in place by Canada be developed following a consultative process with small farms.
Petitions, the Honourable Member for Prince George Peace River.
As BC Caucus Chair, I'd like to present this petition from British Columbians that calls upon all members of Parliament to condemn discrimination against girls occurring through sex-selective pregnancy termination. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Deputy.
The Honourable Member for
Vancouver East.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to rise in the House today to present petitions from Vancouver regarding a fair electoral system, and the people who signed the petition point out that our winner-take-all voting system results in a House of Commons where the number of MPs a party supports does not reflect the number of voters who cast ballots for that party, and they call upon the House of Commons to immediately undertake public consultations across Canada to amend the Canada Elections Act to ensure that voters can cast an equal and effective vote to be represented fairly in Parliament. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Pitt Meadows Maple Ridge Mission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to present this petition signed by residents of British Columbia who believe that the current impaired driving laws are too lenient and need to be strengthened by the implementation of new mandatory minimum sentencing for those convicted of impaired driving causing death. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Gaspésie-Île-la-Madeleine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to table a petition from hundreds of my fellow citizens in my riding, calling on the government to invest in a historic site, and unfortunately, which was considered to be unneeded by Fisheries and Oceans last year. Fisheries and Oceans is trying to cede it to a third party, but there is no third party. That is interesting because Fisheries and Oceans has not invested enough in keeping it up. And so it's time for Fisheries and Oceans to invest.
Member Kitchener Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition from Canadians from the Langley, British Columbia area who are concerned about the fact that due to ultrasounds, many young women, young girls are not being born into this world. It's creating a global gender imbalance, leading to the human trafficking of girls. 92% of Canadians believe that sex-selective pregnancy termination should be illegal, and these petitioners ask all members of Parliament to condemn discrimination against girls occurring through sex-selective pregnancy termination. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm rising today to table a petition with hundreds of names from the South Shore of Montreal, people who are very concerned about the loss of home mail delivery, who feel that this is important, who feel that the jobs that will be lost are very important, and who are concerned about the effect on those with reduced mobility and seniors, and who don't accept that Canada is the only G7 country that is unable to deliver mail to people's homes.
Petitions. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, question 746, Q746 will be answered today. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, if questions Q752 and 753 could be made orders for returns, these returns would be tabled immediately.
Is it the pleasure of the House that questions number Q752 and Q753 be made orders for return and that they be tabled immediately? Agreed and so ordered. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the remaining questions be allowed to stand.
Agreed. Agreed and so ordered. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day. Government Bills Commons. Resuming debate at second reading stage of Bill C-35, Justice for Animals in Service Act, Quanto's Law.
When this matter was last before the House, the Honourable Member for Hamilton East Stony Creek had 5 minutes remaining in his speech. The Honourable Member for Hamilton Stony Creek.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I was sitting there, I was reflecting on the fact I've been in this House 9 years, and this is the first occasion that I've had a split speech like this. And considering where I would try to re-enter the speaking notes that I have, it came to mind that perhaps people having not seen the first 5 minutes, I should reiterate a part of it. I was speaking just before the break on the fact that in 1996, I chaired the largest civil demonstration to that point in time in Canada, in Hamilton, where we had 105,000 protesters. It's not important that we go into why the protest was there, but my point is that this protest was well organized. We had 500 marshals. We had 1,267 busloads of protesters come to town, along with 30 to 40,000 Hamiltonians and area people who took part. And the really significant part of this for us was the fact that there was no arrests, there was no injuries. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the buses even left on time. But taking into account situations where sometimes the crowd might get out of control, such times as if we think in terms of the G20 in Toronto, where there was lots of confrontations between police and the public, lots of controversy, of course, Mr. Speaker, around what happened there. Those of us who have been involved with protests or picket lines, and in my case I had 28 years in the Canadian Labour Movement, we've had those occasions where police services have brought the canine units to the demonstration. In the Toronto area in particular, we see horses come out, and if the public considers the way the horses' equipment is placed on them, they have eye guards. And one of the very distasteful things that has happened in the past is some people took it upon themselves to spike the horses with screwdrivers, and that's why that mask. I raise that because there is some justification, in our opinion, for this particular bill as put before us, although many aspects of the bill are already contained in law, and in particular we have a situation where this particular bill is proposing mandatory minimums. And you will know, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP has very grave concerns about the government mandating how our judiciary should respond to any given particular case. We believe in the NDP that we've put into place judges who over the years, through the evolution of the law that they have studied and they've worked with, and the jurisprudence that's set from case to case to case has to be taken into account whenever they're deciding what kind of sentence that they should impose on somebody who has been found guilty of an offense. To our way of thinking, Mr. Speaker, that kind of skill level and well-informed opinion is essential to the process. Yet time and again we see in this place where the government believes that the government members or the minister are the ones who are the experts. In other words, they're saying it has to be a mandatory minimum sentence because of the fact that they see considerations that judges make in our courts of law as to why or how or what reasoning or the aspects of that particular case. It might say that in one instance you are more forceful with the kind of sentence you give, or in another case you may well say, well, look, there's a lot of things that have occurred in this, and that individual may adjust their activity by a lesser sentence. They may respond well, Mr. Speaker, in fact, to the fact that the court has shown leniency and that individual then returns to the community and becomes a better citizen because of that. I do want to end, Mr. Speaker, because I see you're giving me the short sign here, that the NDP supports this bill going to committee. I don't believe I said that in the first 5 minutes. It's important because we're prepared to sit down and see if we can make this bill better, and we certainly will bring our concerns about the mandatory minimum sentencing. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I will end. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Gaspésie-Île-la-Madeleine. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I listened very closely to my colleague's speech. I think that his concerns are well-founded. I think it is very important to realize that this is a good bill, and it deserves to be debated further to a vote at second reading in committee. We want to hear from experts, and I agree with him that I think that experts on prison sentences need to be heard from. We have seen the result that judges hesitate to impose mandatory minimums, and we have even seen legislation overturned by the courts. We put the question to the Minister of Justice yesterday, how much all these trials are costing the federal government to defend their legislation that is flawed. And unfortunately, he appeared to be unable to respond to the question. So I would like to put the question to my colleague. Does he think perhaps that there are too many resources from the Department of Justice that are being funneled towards defending legislation that often judges are challenging concerning mandatory minimums?
The honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek. Order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Agriculture is rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for interrupting the debate, but what I'd like to do, Mr. Speaker, is just ask for the unanimous consent of the House to revert back to presentation of reports from committees, as I do have a report here from the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food that
there is no consent. The honourable member from Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Trying to refresh my memory now on my friend's question. The reality is oftentimes excuse me, Mr. Speaker, but oftentimes in the application, I'm sorry, I'm totally distracted by this, Mr. Speaker.
Order. If the members would like to carry on this conversation, the back of the chamber, the honourable member from Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the week, I think we're subject to distraction much easier. In response to my friend, he was talking about how the resources are applied or not applied, and the implicit part of his question was whether or not the government had gone over the top. I'll use an example of mandatory minimums in the state of Texas. Texas is seen around the world as one of the more aggressive states in the American Union relative to crime and punishment. And they're actually they're actually closing prisons in the state of Texas because of the failure of this program. And so I think it's important that when this bill goes to committee, it gets the examination it really, truly deserves. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions and comments? Question et commentaire, l'honorable.
The honourable member for Les Aliments. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his speech and the important points he raised therein. I know that for my colleague, that in this House of Commons, he feels that it's important to discuss the priorities of Canadians, as do we all. Now, does he consider that the bill that we are debating in the most minute detail, without much intervention from the government, does he feel that this is a great priority for Canadians?
The honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Well, I want to thank the member for the question, because that takes us back again to earlier in the debate where our friend from Timmins James Bay was talking about the imbalances he saw between the priorities of this government, where we have bill after bill with significant, complicated issues. They get time allocation. In fact, it's in excess of 80. And I don't want to minimize the fact that it is important to take care of the service animals that the police use and the search and rescue animals. And we support this bill in the essence, but we find it interesting that bills that have very significant issues in them that Canadians are very concerned with are pushed aside with time allocation, and this bill is getting a lot more time. It should be just sent to committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to rise today to speak about this in support of Bill C-35, an act to amend the Criminal Code, law enforcement animals, military animals, and service animals, Quantrill's law. And in contradiction to the comments just made by the opposition members, I think that these are actually very important pieces of legislation to discuss and to move forward, because it actually has a huge impact on all Canadians. This bill, named after Quantrill, a dedicated and decorated Edmonton Police Service animal, was killed last year while assisting in the apprehension of a fleeing subject. Quantrill's death was widely reported across the country. It reignited efforts by police to have the criminal law amended to specifically criminalize acts on law enforcement animals, and more importantly, to recognize the valuable services they play to Canadians. I think slightly in contrast to what the opposition member was commenting on earlier. A comment that was made and a commitment that was made in the speech from the throne. And I'm pleased today to be able to speak about this very important bill. I'm also pleased to see that the bill has proposed and is providing specific protections not just to law enforcement animals, but to other kinds of service animals, namely military and service animals that assist individuals with disabilities. Having seen, particularly for those individuals that have disabilities, the assistance that these animals provide, I think, is extremely important and something that Canadians overwhelmingly support. The proposed amendments would amend the Criminal Code to create a specific offence prohibiting the willful and unlawful killing or injury of a law enforcement animal, a service animal, or a military animal. The bill defines each of these terms. A law enforcement animal is defined as a dog or horse that is trained to aid a law enforcement officer in carrying out the officer's duties. While the focus of this bill has properly been on Quantrill, a German Shepherd, I think it's important to recall that horses are also still a significant part of Canadian law enforcement agencies. For example, police services are used in crowd control situations. They're well suited for this type of patrol activity as long as they are trained properly. Officers on the horses have a commanding view of the crowd, but more importantly, the added height and visibility to the horses' riders serves in both ways. It allows officers to see what's going on in the wider area, but it also allows people in that area to know where the officers are. This helps deter crime, but it also helps people find the officers when they need them. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, having been in New York City with an urgent circumstance. I was in downtown New York, traveling with my younger sibling. She's a diabetic and experienced a reaction. I had taken her out of the cab we were in, and the first person I saw was a law enforcement officer on horseback who came immediately to our aid and was able to support us. I would not have seen that individual if they were just walking in the crowd. It was because of the opportunity that I could see them immediately and get care immediately for my sibling that she actually was taken to hospital within a few minutes. And so that, very similar to incidents like on May 2010, when 2 street vendors in New York sought help when they saw smoke rising out of a crude car bomb. Again, an opportunity for citizens to react, know where help is, move to those individuals, those police officers who could respond and clearly help innocent bystanders to move them out of the way, but also to help the circumstances. In an emergency, horses are also able to move through the crowd easily. And during non-emergency times, horses and officers typically are well received by crowds. Well-trained horses don't spook. And when they hear loud noises or sudden bangs, and they stand firm and calm, often very much calming the crowd. And I'm certain you will also recall, Mr. Speaker, a very high-profile incident that occurred in 2006 when Brigadier, an 8-year-old Toronto Police Services horse, was killed in the line of duty by a motor vehicle whose driver barreled into the horse as well as into the mounted officer. Both of the Brigadier's front legs were broken, left shattered so badly that he would not recover. And he was finally put down after his long-term service. Now, military animals, according to the new Act, will be defined as an animal that is trained to aid a member of the Canadian Forces in carrying out their members' duties. And a service animal is defined as an animal that is required by a person with a disability for assistance and is certified in writing as having been trained by professional services, animals institutions, to assist a person with a disability. And I think most Canadians see this work every day. These animals work in the workplace, in the community, aiding individuals with disabilities with better access to their community and all of their surroundings. The conduct described by the offence is also prohibited under the more general animal cruelty offences, which apply to all animals. But their targeted nature reflects the somewhat distinct harm caused when a service animal is attacked, relative to animals that might otherwise just be pets, for instance. The new offence would carry a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment on indictment and 18 months and/or a fine of up to $10,000 on summary conviction. This is also consistent with the sentencing range for the more general animal cruelty offences. However, Bill C-35 would require courts to give primary consideration to denunciation and deterrence as sentencing objectives in respect of the new offence. Many have spoken in this chamber about the importance of protecting law enforcement animals and animals that perform valuable services for other government agencies such as the Canadian Border Services Agency and the Canadian Forces. But for myself, I will speak specifically to the aspect of the legislation with respect to protecting service animals that perform tasks that permit individuals with disabilities to live more independent lives. Like their counterparts that assist police services, service animals perform a variety of functions. Perhaps the most well-known, I think most Canadians have seen, is seeing eye dogs that assist individuals with visual impairment to navigate through their daily lives. These animals in particular have opened up wide, new, far-reaching experiences for Canadians with visible and visual disabilities. But there are also other kinds of service animals. Just as guide dogs are trained to alert their owners to potential hazards that they can't see, hearing dogs are similarly trained with respect to fire alarms or to make sure that those with hearing impairments actually are well taken care of. I can tell you, for those children that sit in classrooms every day that have a dog that hears for them, it allows them to more purposely participate in their everyday school activities and, quite frankly, interact with all of their classmates. It means that they know when the bell rings to go out for school. And I think it would be a sheer travesty if at any point in time one of these animals was injured, because it would severely limit the opportunities for these children to participate even in their daily lives at school. People with mental disabilities make use of psychiatric service dogs to retrieve medications, as well as activate medical alert or lead the person out of a crowd when they're anxious. A person who has epilepsy or other seizure disorders may have a seizure alert assist dog, seizure response dog, or an animal to alert them when their seizure might be upcoming and steer their owner away from danger during a seizure or something that may activate their medical challenge. Other types of service dogs can assist persons with physical disabilities, whether that's helping lift them out of a wheelchair or carrying specific objects, pushing buttons on the elevator, or providing balance for a person with mobile challenges. And I can tell you that these animals play a pivotal role for these Canadians. It means that they are better integrated into their communities. It means that they can go out and enjoy time with their friends as opposed to staying only at home. It often means functioning even well at home for the basics of necessities so that they can lead more independent lives. And once again, as I've said before, making sure that these animals are well protected and that they are protected under the criminal code, I think, is essential, because the limitations to these Canadians, if they did not have this service, would be devastating. The training of a service animal is an expensive proposition and represents months of work. And these animals must be trained to be good-natured and obedient in a variety of circumstances, protecting their owners, but also making sure that they interact well with the public. Some breeds are better than others, but we know that dogs are the most chosen because they're friendly, loyal, and patient. And typically, a potential service animal undergoes extensive behavioral training before being accepted for a training program. Working with their disabled partners for more independence and freedom, I think we should be thanking individuals that both train these animals and the animals themselves for their service and companionship. And therefore, I'm pleased to support this bill and propose and encourage all those here in the House of Commons to support this, because it so overwhelmingly helps individuals with disabilities lead more important and independent lives, integrating better into Canadian society. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Gaspésie, Ille-Madeleine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Colleague from the opposite side for her presentation. I too agree with her that this bill has a lot of merit. I think it merits going to committee for more discussion. I think there are certain elements in this bill that deserve expert testimony to see if the elements that are being presented are the best ways to bring this matter forward. But overall, certainly bringing it to committee is definitely a step that we should be encouraging all members to support. I would ask her the question, though, when it comes to the minimal sentences that this bill is introducing, does she not agree that there's been an awful lot of challenges in courts regarding minimum sentences, and that this is costing the judicial system and the taxpayer a lot of money? There's an awful lot of labor that's being expended from our Justice Department defending bills that are finally, the elements of bills that are finally being defeated in the courts only have to be brought back to this House for, again, another look. Shouldn't we be asking experts their position on minimum sentences? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Well, I appreciate the member's comments that this should go to committee for fulsome discussion, and delighted to hear that the opposition supports that. But, you know, as I mentioned before, and I think we should be very clear, a service animal and the death of that service animal has a resounding impact on a Canadian. And if there are individuals that believe that the willful harm of these animals should not face the full extent of the law, I, quite frankly, completely disagree. We should be moving forward to make sure that these service animals, animals that serve police officers, but most importantly those that are disabled, are well protected. And I'm very fully supportive of what we're doing here because it enforces that opportunity for Canadians.
Question commentaire on
the honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. I particularly liked the fact that she spoke about her own history. She's aware of the importance of these animals. But I would just like to restate what has clearly been said concerning mandatory minimum sentences. So even though the NDP is going to support this bill, even the Minister of Justice said that mandatory minimums have no deterrent effect that have been demonstrated. So could my colleagues speak to any scientific evidence that would support that and explain why there are mandatory minimums in this bill.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think that it's extremely important that Canadians understand how important it is that these service animals are available to support Canadians. Look, similar to the opposition, I look forward to the discussion that takes place at committee. I think that that's fulsome debate is always constructive, and we'll definitely move this bill towards its endpoint, which is becoming law and therefore enforceable, so that these animals are protected and therefore they're of service to Canadians. Thank you.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm here today in this House in order to speak to this bill, which is so important. That was part of the speech to the throne in 2013. And I have to say that in preparing for this debate, I learned a great deal about these service animals, whether it is through their work for the police, the army, or people who are disabled. It creates special links between animals and human beings. This bill is intended to provide extra protection in the criminal code for these animals by stiffening sentences for violence against them. I want to deal with three important aspects of the bill. That is, the important role that service animals play in Canadian society, the problems caused by the overuse of minimum sentences by the government, and the message sent to judges through this bill. In the history of humanity, the domestication of animals was an important step in our young civilization. There is no need to remind people of the enormous progress made in the way that in which we treat animals over time. We have created laws banning any kind of cruelty to animals, and in this regard, the NDP has played its part. For example, through Bills C-232 and C-592. As far as service animals are concerned, humans have managed to deal with certain shortcomings by using the strength of animals in action. Now, whether it's through the canine units, the RCMP, provincial police forces, or border services, animals play an important role in our safety and security. They're used in many ways, in search and rescue, detecting explosives and drugs, to chase down offenders, to find missing people, crowd control, and there are many other ways as well in which they help. This bill bears the name of a dog, Quanto. It is intended to recognize the work that this dog did with the Edmonton Police with Sergeant Trevor Hermanitz. The dog was stabbed in the course of his work. He had been decorated and participated in more than 100 arrests over the course of his active service. We often think of dogs and canine units, but we also have to emphasize the work done by the canine units with certain police forces. Horses also, in particular, give police a higher profile and can get to areas that are difficult to access. I don't want to forget to mention the exceptional work that service animals do with disabled people as well. One of my constituents suffers from post-traumatic stress syndrome because of their tour in Afghanistan, and he has recognized the important role played by his animal in his healing process. We cannot either forget or estimate the cost of training and raising these animals. It costs $60,000 to the RCMP to train a single German Shepherd. They have 157 police dogs in service across the country. It costs $30,000 to the Mira Foundation to train a service animal. But despite these, we recognize the work done by these animals. We all recognize the work done by the canine units and the horse units. The problem is when we start examining the parts of the bill that are some of the sections in this bill. The devil is in the details. So there are a series of questions that I hope will be answered. How many assistance or service animals are the victims of attacks per year? what is the impact, the real impact of mandatory minimums on offenders, and what deterrents are put in place. I'd like the Conservatives to provide us with the studies that clearly demonstrate the deterrent effect of mandatory minimums or minimum sentences. This is why the committee needs to study the bill. In its 2014 report, the Auditor General of Canada is concerned about overpopulation in the prisons. This explains the urgent need to increase the capacity of prisons and is not the answer, in fact. The Auditor General sees a direct correlation between mandatory minimum sentences and the overpopulation of prisons. When continuing to increase their policies on mandatory minimum sentences, we are putting people in danger, and especially those who use service dogs. Is that really what the government wants? Correctional services officers are a professional group that are exposed to a high level of risk at work. Even more worrisome, the Auditor General believes that they are stretching the elastic band beyond its capacity in terms of prisons. The use of minimum sentences and the excessive use, as the government is doing, concerns me tremendously, and it also worries the people of my riding. In Canada, we believe that in the efficiency of the judicial system. This is accomplished through competent judges who take one case at a time and properly reference our laws. However, over the years, the government has limited the powers of judges. It has limited their power to take decisions on a case-by-case basis. And we know that the Conservatives have had several losses in the terms of judgments from the Supreme Court, which is a waste of time and money for Canadians. Therefore, we have to be careful concerning the scope of these bills and not limit the ability of judges to act. We must not once again take away from the courts of justice and the tribunals the discretionary powers that they have. The NDP speaks out against any form of cruelty towards animals. That's a fact. I'll take a few seconds to recognize the exceptional work that service animals do and that their teams do. However, we have to ask questions about the consequences of minimum sentences and consecutive sentences, rather. That's why this bill needs to be studied by experts from civil society and people who use service animals, but particularly legal experts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. It was very interesting, and I also support the bill, which is before the House today. But I would like her to expand on the Conservatives' approach, because this is far from the first bill that has mandatory minimum sentences in it. Could she speak to some of the previous Conservative bills that have mandatory minimums, and could she speak a bit also about the effect that these bills are going to have on our prisons and on Canada's approach in this regard? The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. She's given me the opportunity to speak on this. It's not exactly what we're discussing today, but there are repercussions to all of this. And almost every bill that the Conservatives, the government has tabled, there's almost always something that undermines the discretionary powers of the judges. I've seen it with several bills, and we've talked about it in this House. I think it's very dangerous for our democracy. Furthermore, it's difficult to control. You know, at one point in time, I saw a judge hand down a sentence that was to wash windows for someone who had gone around breaking windows. He was a young offender, and the judge had discretionary power to do so. But with these kinds of bills, those discretionary powers disappear. and we lose the opportunity to reintegrate someone like that easily. The Honourable Member for La Salle-et-Marne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Speaker. I can't help asking my colleague the same question, in fact, that I asked several members here who spoke to this bill, C-35. And indeed, I heard the Minister of Labour and the Status of Women, and I was quite surprised. There's a government member who's talking about a bill that was, in the beginning, a private member's bill, and now all of a sudden it's become a great priority for the government to have the Minister of Labour and Status of Women here to speak to this. Does this government not have other priorities than to speak in great depth about a bill that people seem to more or less agree on in several ways? Does this not concern my colleague, the Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles? I thank the member for her question. She always has very far-reaching questions, very interesting questions. These are dogs trained to defend us. It's easy to want to protect them. But when we know that there are more than 1,000 women who have been either murdered or are missing, it seems to be a double standard here. We all support this bill to protect dogs and perhaps punish those who have attacked a dog, because, as I said earlier, it becomes like we humanize the dogs, really. But there are issues that are more important, like missing and murdered women, Aboriginal women in this country.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
Is the House ready for the question? The question is as follows. Mr. McKay, Central Nova, seconded by Mr. Duncan, Vancouver Island North, move that Bill C-35, an act to amend the Criminal Code, law enforcement animals, military animals, and service animals, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. Agreed. On division? Yes. Agreed, and so ordered.
Second reading of this bill, deuxième lecture de ce projet de loi.
Accordingly, the bill stands referred to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. The Honourable Member for Oxford, rising on point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I believe if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent to see the clock as 1:30.
Does the Honourable Member have unanimous consent? He does. It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper.
Private members' business, resuming debate at second reading on Bill S-218, an act respecting National Fielding Day.
Reprise du débat, l'honorable député.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Compton-Stansted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am excited and honored to speak to this bill. It would have been fun, it would have been more interesting if it had come from the House, from a member here. But S-218 is a bill respecting National Fiddling Day. So what does that mean? What exactly are we talking about here? Because in Quebec, we listen to the fiddle in the wintertime. It warms our hearts. It warms people up. It makes them happy. And it makes them dance and sing. And the traditional violin, it's perhaps not just in Quebec and in the east of Canada, but this is something that really we deal with mostly in the winter. Perhaps it's a long tradition and it's cultural to want that sound, that joy that our ancestors had, our uncles from playing the violin. When they had big family reunions, we'd all get into the living room and get ready to have a party. And then we'd say mon oncle Gilles and ma tante Rosanne dancing while somebody played the violin. Well, that's how it was in Quebec at home. But unfortunately, this tradition is almost lost. It's almost lost because with an aging population, of course, there are other aspects and other reasons why this has disappeared. Perhaps everyone's just in too much of a hurry, running around, chasing their tails, trying to make both ends meet. Maybe there's an impact in that regard, but in my former career, I was a sound engineer and a producer of shows. So we'd go into basements of churches where there were amateur shows, and we saw, fairs that we'd have in the country, but all of these kinds of fairs, because of budget cutbacks and restraints everywhere, this culture and tradition that we had of meeting as friends in this way, not just in the winter time, but at many times in community parties and get-togethers. I think that the last show that I produced, or that I participated in, was back in the early 1990s. I think it was in Asbestos or maybe Windsor. And since then, I've seen almost nothing of the kind. It's more and more rare at home in Quebec. And even if we've had some young groups who've started to revive this and perpetuate this tradition by making somewhat more traditional music, we can see that we've gained some ground back. But I can only name one person who's really the heir of this tradition, and that's Mr. Alain Lamontagne, who is traveling across the country with his violin and his band to carry on this tradition. And there's responsorial songs and chants, and that's what traditional violin really allows us to perpetuate, to carry on. And a framework that, as I mentioned, was often festive, and we often saw with community parties, and but now with the lack of budget, this kind of festival and party hardly exists. They don't produce that kind of music anymore, unfortunately.
And I say unfortunately because these are traditions that are being lost. We're going to lose these traditions, and where I come from, one of the national flag bearers, Thibert Richard, yes, the father of Michel Richard, who is from our area and was really one of the flag bearers of traditional fiddling for years and years. And with Whippy Ledo, who's a TV personality from our area, he was part of the Soirée Canadienne on CBC Radio-Canada. This was part of our tradition, and unfortunately it's disappeared, and most of the protagonists, the participants, have passed away since many years, but it was a way for Quebecers to come together and to celebrate, to have festivities around these responsorial songs. And it was part of the pleasure to see some of our favorite national figures play the fiddle, including some whose false teeth would fly across the room while they were dancing. These are great memories that we have, and so to want to keep these traditions going, well, that's something that we really want to do, and the NDP would really like to see more attention paid to culture in general. We'd like to see more investments in culture, generally speaking. And we can talk about, there are all kinds of festivals in the regions that are dying out. There are traditions that are dying out because there just isn't a budget to keep them going. And it's very hard to understand how it's amazing what kind of an influence music can have on community life. But here, we're talking about music today. Myself, I'm a rock musician, a guitarist. But musician means having an open mind. And when I hear traditional musicians, it brings tears to my eyes because it reminds me of great old memories. And memories where the family, our whole family would come together, and we would talk about everything, even politics. Back in the day it was blue and red, but now there's orange in that discussion as well. And I'm certainly very happy about that. But listen, these traditions with a days like this, well, certainly personally, I would have liked to have had this day be in winter because it would have brought back memories for everyone. I think that May is not necessarily the best time of the year for this day, but that's my personal opinion. But I have to say that when it comes to the way that we fund and manage the artistic community now, there are those who say that we offer too many subsidies to artists. But listen, there are countries where culture is funded at 100%. What does that mean? Well, it ensures that there are mechanisms and structures in place that ensure that certain traditions will be kept alive, be it art, be it traditional song, painting, all kinds of art. Well, here in Canada, we have a tendency to forget what our artists from across Canada bring to this country. And if we want to try to define Canada from ocean to ocean to ocean, we look at its culture. Always culture, be it the culture of First Nations, be it Newfoundlanders, Albertans, Quebecers. We look at what are the traditions, what do they do to celebrate, what do they do to keep entertained, and it's the arts, the expression of arts that answers all of that. It's the form of the artistic expression. That's our tradition, our heritage. And we need to do everything we can to keep these traditions going, or we'll lose them. And if we lose them, we lose our identity at the same time. It's so important for everyone that we keep our culture and our traditions, be it for First Nations, for immigrants who come here from around the world. They keep their culture alive. So why forget all of that? Everyone has the right to practice their art. And it's when we should keep all of that alive. It helps maintain good nations between men and women, between nations, between First Nations and all Canadians from one ocean to another. It's so important because, as I've been saying, it brings back good memories. And it brings back memories of happy times, of traditional parties. And the NDP fully agrees with Bill S-218. I'll say it again. It seems to me that fiddling in the winter or at Christmas time brings us all around a warm fire, and that's my favorite memory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I understand the honourable member from Thunder Bay Rainy River is rising on point of order.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a point of order arising out of question period. I misspoke when I said the government had returned $7.5 million to the Treasury last year from FedNor. What I really meant to say was that $11 million has been returned over the last 4 years, along with a $30 million cut to the FedNor budget. I apologize to the Minister for my lack of mathematical skills.
Thank you. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Cape Breton Canso.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. And I, too, am very excited about being able to join in this debate. We do have the world's largest fiddle in Cape Breton at the waterfront in Sydney. It was built in 2005, and it's something that tourists from around the world have come to have their pictures taken in front of and enjoy the great fiddle music that comes from Cape Breton and Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy our party, most in our party, are supporting this bill because I think it's significant. It's something to be celebrated, and I think it keeps that tradition, proud tradition of the fiddle, out front, because we can't always take it for granted. There's a great story that's part of the history and that's told from generation to generation back in Mabo, which is really the epicenter, the cultural sort of soul of Cape Breton and the Celtic spirit in Cape Breton. And they talk about Father Kenneth MacDonald, who served as the parish priest back in 1860 and for a number of years. And he wasn't a big fan of the fiddle. He wasn't a big fan of a lot of things, dancing and libations and what all that it took. So he thought that the fiddle was a bit of an evil. So he took it upon himself to go door to door and gather up the fiddles in Mabu and to take that away from them. Well, it may have worked for the short time, but certainly Mabu, as I said, is really seen as the focal point of not just fiddling. You know, we're all very much aware of the Rankin family. You know, a great fiddler with the Rankin family, John Morris Rankin. But you know, it really becomes a mecca, especially during the Celtic Colours Festival that we host every fall. But there was a period of time, even past the gathering of the fiddles in Mabu back at that time. There was, I want to refer to a documentary that was put forward by CBC. Ran a documentary in 1972 called The Vanishing Cape Breton Fiddler. And it was produced by Ron McGuinness. And it talked about the decline in the number of those that were playing the fiddle in Cape Breton at the time. And they thought it was on the verge of distinction. So there was a group of folks got together, some key people got together and vowed that they wouldn't let this happen. Frankie McGuinness from Craignish, Father Eugene Morris from Mabu, Bert McIntyre from Waikagama, Archie Neil Chisholm, Father Janangus Rankin, who was really one of the real driving forces behind it, Rod Chisholm, Judge Hugh J. McPherson, Anne-Marie McDonald, Jeanette Beaton, Joey Beaton, Ray McDonald. And this group got together and they said, we can't let this happen. We just can't let fiddle music die in Cape Breton. So they embarked on a plan where they were going to pull together a group, an organization. So from that was born the Cape Breton Fiddlers Association. The Fiddlers Association, a lot of it under the guidance of my good friend Betty Ann Matheson, but the Fiddlers Association year after year puts on the major festival at the Gaelic College in St. Anne's, Cape Breton, which draws thousands of people to come and hundreds of fiddlers to come and learn and take workshops and perform. And even those that have gone on to great careers, that have been very successful in the music industry, continue to return to this festival each year to be with their fellow fiddlers and to continue to learn and grow and share, Mr. Speaker. And that, as I said, that takes place each year. We also, from that, again, you know, we understood that you can't be complacent, and many in the fiddling community knew that. And we've got some people that have stepped up, and guys like Eddie Rogers, who's originally from Guysborough but has lived in Cape Breton for a number of years, and the work that he continues to do with so many of the young people, young fiddlers, inspiring the next generation of fiddlers. So it's a tradition that's passed down from generation to generation, most times in the kitchens, but a lot of times in the dance halls and far beyond. There's a great quote, Mr. Speaker, from the late and great John Allen Cameron. John Allen said, when I was growing up, the two most important people in the community were the fiddler and the priest. And anybody that comes from a rural community, they can certainly attest to that the high esteem great fiddlers are held in. And when we talk about some of the great fiddlers in Cape Breton, Winston Scotty Fitzgerald, who really he was a bit of ahead of his time in recording fiddle music and a lot of the traditional fiddle tunes, which laid the groundwork for future generations. Dan Joe McGuinness from Big Pond, Lee Cremo, famous First Nations fiddler from Eskasoni, Carl McKenzie. As I had said, the Rankins, the late John Morris Rankin was an accomplished fiddle player. This past year, we just lost Buddy McMaster. And although Buddy was born in Timmins, moved to Judic at an early age, and Buddy McMaster was just a a phenomenal fiddle player, just a beautiful, caring man and sharing man. And really, you know, it was through the commitment of these people that they continue to share and inspire young fiddlers. And of course, Buddy's niece, Natalie, went on, and she didn't have a bad career herself. Natalie's an accomplished musician and married to Donnell Leahy, who himself is a fabulous performer. And the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. Jerry Holland, you know, some of the greats. Of course, you know, we couldn't talk about fiddlers from the area, from Cape Breton, unless we gave a shout out to Ashley McIsaac. And I remember in 2010 when we watched the opening of the Olympics in Vancouver, and we saw, of course, K.D. Lang doing Leonard Cohen's Alleluia, and just how inspiring that was. But then out comes Ashley, and doing his rendition of Devil in the Kitchen, and he just not only lit up the opening ceremonies, not just for the people in the place, but he lit up the airwaves as well. And I had the great opportunity to see both Ashley and his cousin Wendy McIsaac perform at Celtic Colours opening gala just early in October, and it was an incredible performance that they put on. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, we continue to have, you know, I think by hosting these events, and certainly when we look at, you know, having a day that recognizes fiddling, I think that it can only continue to help grow the art, and I commend Senator Libby Hubly for putting this bill herself. She's an accomplished fiddler, but I think it's, you know, it's going to be something, I think, that will be embraced far beyond the fiddling community. I think it'll be something that will be embraced and enjoyed by many. Certainly, when you look at the impact, of when you look at the impact of Celtic Colours on our community and the thousands of people that come from around the world to enjoy Celtic Colours, I think you can see opportunities like that. I was warned by a good friend of mine, I can't be talking about fiddlers unless we give a shout out to the Hilda Chessons and the Dougie McPhees and the Teresa McNeils, you know, the Billy McPhees. These are, you know, it's like the pitcher and the catcher. You got to have a piano player too. So, you know, we had to give a shout out to the piano player. So I don't know if there's going to be a piano players bill coming forward. And Rodney, our former premier and great friend who runs the Gaelic College now, his buddy Glenn Graham, Rodney McDonald, and in Cape Breton it's just Rodney. It's like Elvis. So you don't even need the last name. But Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to speak on this, and I want to commend the senator for bringing this bill forward. Thank you.
Resuming debate. Is the House ready for the question? The question is as follows. Mrs. O'Neill Gordon, seconded by Mr. Weston St. John, move that Bill S-218, an act respecting National Fiddling Day, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Agreed, and so ordered.
Bill, deuxième lecture de ce projet de loi.
Accordingly, the bill stands referred to the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. It being 1:17, this House stands adjourned until next Monday at 11 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 2401. Hey.